Awesome. So welcome, everyone. This is a very exciting session because we are essentially trying to think about the generalized adversarial collaborations and how they went and what we can do better. So welcome to this year's virtual CCN. As you all know, hopefully, these are the people that are behind CCN: Thomas Nassalaris, Henrike Nienborg, Russ Poldrack, and Kenrick Kai. And the program committee that has given you, or is giving you this year's selection of session can be found here. So Megan and I are co-chairing it, and we had a really nice, amazing team who helped us put together all the innovative formats that you're currently experiencing, I hope. And of course, if you have any feedback, please let us know. We're always happy to improve things. So the three different components that we have this year are the Generative Adversarial Collaboration. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Keynote and tutorials and Algonauts. If you're missing any of those sessions, they are all recorded and you can find the recording online free of access. Okay, so we will be talking about generative adversarial collaborations. I want to briefly remind you what they are. So we all know that science benefits from alternative ideas and theories, but one of the issues, of course, is that very often researchers try to prove their own theory right instead of really asking what theory is the right one, and so like trading them off in a fair way. And so this is where we think that the GACs come into play. So it would allow researchers with alternative theories to essentially collaborate, to work together to resolve their differences. And together essentially design the fairest or best possible way that they all agree upon to disambiguate the theories or the point of views. And we think that this is nice because it allows for like a healthy, friendly, and collaborative competition that ultimately we think accelerates scientific progress. We also hope that this has a lot of benefits to the community in many different ways. So for one is we would like to foster an open public debate. So all the materials, including the GAC proposals, the presentations, the kickoff meetings, the position papers, etc., are all open, and we would like the community to get engaged as much as possible. We would like essentially for the community to work out the differences, and the more people participate, the merrier. So all the kickoff meetings are meant not just for the actual team to discuss, but also potentially for others that are interested in the topic to engage in discussion and contribute to the progress of the team. So diversity and number of ideas is what we're looking for. Of course, like science should always ask important questions. And so by providing this platform of GAC groups, essentially, we essentially hope that it's like a democratic way of deciding what the field thinks is important or what our community, CCN community thinks is important, and then organize sort of like a collaborative effort around that to answer these important questions. And as I said, we're trying to do this in a very transparent way. So we have to kick off the position paper with avenues forward. There will be outcomes. You can write commentary papers if you want, and anyone can get engaged. Megan, you want to take over?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, as Gunnar said, this is really meant to be a community effort. And so in service of that community effort, again, all of the public materials can be found here, and we can paste some of these links in the chat as well. So I'll do that as soon as I'm done talking here. And all of the position papers are going into this special issue in Neurons, Behavior, Data Analysis, and Theory. And this will include those commentary pieces, and those commentary solicitations are still open. So please go read the pieces, go read the preprints if the final piece is not out and published yet, and you can submit a commentary, and that commentary, if it goes through peer review, just like everything else, and then once published, it gets attached to the main piece and it gets its own DOI. And so we hope that this is really a way for the community to get engaged, but also in a way that recognizes that engaging in these efforts is not free. It takes effort, it takes time. And so we want to reward the community by especially encouraging younger scientists to get involved you can get a paper on your CV and put it in the rest of the list of everything that you're doing. And so this is not just a, do charity work for the community and participate in open review because you want to kind of thing, but it's also a way that we can recognize the effort and time and dedication of the CCN community in participating in this effort. So if you missed last year's GAC workshops, they were really, really engaging and really fun, and sometimes got a little heated, which was I think pretty cool. And so all of the recordings can be found on our website and then also on the CCN YouTube channel. So they're all there. You can go and watch them and see where those debates started. And then to put that in context, this is now where they have ended up 1 year later. And so the progress and process is what we're going to talk about today. So first, for the first kind of half of the session or thereabouts, we're going to have a progress update, which is all about the science. So we're going to hear from each of the one member of each of the generative adversarial collaboration groups to talk about what scientific progress has been made. How did this particular type of collaboration lead to changes in thinking and advances for the field? So, maybe what couldn't have happened otherwise, or what was a new advance that you found over the past year. And then we also want to recognize that 1 year is not enough to resolve what we hope are some of the most exciting and innovative controversies in the field. And so we want to say, well, maybe you resolved some stuff, but also maybe some of the controversies actually deepened or changed. So we want to say which ones of those changed and how did they change? And then also, what are the plans of this group for the future, for the coming year and going forward? And we'll take a quick break and let people use the restroom and so on. And then we'll come back and do a process update that's a little bit more of the meta science component to say what worked about these collaborations and what also didn't work, what was challenging, especially given that these teams are geographically and time zones spread out. Were there logistical challenges that maybe could be overcome going forward? And then we'll also have a lot of time, we hope, for a panel discussion, not just among all of the folks who are part of the GAC teams, but also among all of you. So this is an opportunity for all of the audience to get involved. And we will use the Zoom technology, we hope, to either pull people into the panel or at least give everybody a microphone so that you can contribute and ask questions and participate in the discussion. So that's the plan for today. And we will then go ahead and go right on to this order. So these are our 6 original GAC teams. So we'll hear from 1 or 2 members of each of these teams about the scientific updates, and then we will take that break and then go on to process. So I think that is it. And I will go ahead, and while we're getting started, I will drop some of the links to the website and so on into the chat so that you guys can also have that up for reference and exploration later. And that website links not only to the recordings, but also to the original proposals and the position pieces and all of that stuff. So I'll do that, and we can just go ahead and get going with the first update, which is from the Grid Codes group. So Linda, I believe that's you.
Hi, so let me just share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the full screen? Yes, okay. Hi, so I'm happy to give an update to the GAC on grid codes. So what we did in this GAC is that we had 2 points of view on what is a good model for a grid code in the brain, the entorhinal grid code that's used in navigation, and we think are used in other cognitive processes as well. So the one that I'm presenting here is the successor representation point of view. So basically, in this point of view, the grid code is thought to be the eigenvectors of the successor representation, which is simply the discounted expected occupancy of states. So if in this picture of this rat, You can see that the successor representation or the expected occupancy is highest in the current state and then trails off where it is discounted in the previous states. And it's sort of a transition matrix that is learned through direct experience that is policy dependent. And people have thought, or some people have thought, that this is a good model for place cells. And then if you take the eigenvectors or the principal components of that, you get grid code. And so what we were trying to figure out in this GAC is whether that grid code is can enable generalization, that is to transfer structure across environments to enable one-shot learning of something that you've never experienced in that environment. So one thing that we sort of thought about is that there are some forms of generalization that taking the eigenvectors of the successor representation can give you automatically. So one example of that is something called spectral regularization. So that's sort of just like if you have a picture or a matrix and you have an algorithm or a successor representation that learns the structure of the rest of this matrix, it can then fill in some cells that are blank. So in this example, if you learn that the left group 2 fractals leads to this banana outcome, but not to the strawberry outcome, and the right group of fractals leads to the strawberry, but not the banana. So if you learn the structure, and then you learn that for the cookie and the chocolate outcomes, one of each group, the fractals lead to equivalent outcomes, as was the case for the strawberry and the banana, you can use the principal components of that to fill in those like gray missing cells. So that's something eigenvectors can give you. But another thing that we're hoping sort of to figure out is whether rotations of the grid code, which is observed experimentally across contexts, when you have a rat and you put them in a different box, you see their grid codes rotate in concert. Does that process preserve the relationship between stimuli? So here you see that, a beach ball stimulus leads to the teddy bear stimulus, and that stimulus maybe in this first context is in the direction towards the east, and it goes across the grid codes, firing fields in that way. And then you go to different contexts, and now, maybe the cardinal direction is different. Now it's going to the northwest rather than the east. But hopefully you should still be able to infer or understand that the beach ball stimulus has the same relationship to the teddy bear stimulus, and be able to preserve that relationship even if the direction of it or the orientation of it has changed. So the step that we were trying to take during this GAC, or we're trying to figure out, is whether the grid code, or what it would take for the grid code to do a more challenging form of generalization. So in this example that I presented, at the beginning of this process last year, was whether, so this example where you're used to going to the Trader Joe's, this grocery store on the left, and then you encounter a new grocery store that you've never been to, this Whole Foods on the right. Can you find milk without having to relearn the whole structure of the Whole Foods? And so what we thought is that perhaps the grid code or the structure that you learned in the Trader Joe's can simply rotate, as is the case for when you put a rat into a different box, and transfer the structure, so the relationship between the different aisles in the grocery store, like the dairy section or the produce section, and map that onto the Whole Foods so that you don't have to look for milk all over again. You know exactly where it is, like, right off the bat. So one thing that we sort of discovered came up during the GAC process was that in order for that kind of transfer to happen, there needs to be additional step. So the problem is that the transition structure between these two grocery stores, between the specific stimuli, are obviously going to be very different. There are different items in these grocery stores. They look different. The stimuli is definitely different. And so in order for there to be a transfer structure, there needs to be an additional step of extraction of the latent attribute of the concept of like the produce aisle or the dairy aisle, and so on and so forth. And so in terms of future questions, we want to now do experiments and figure out whether different parts of the brain, for example, the prefrontal cortex, might be responsible for extracting these relevant latent attributes that then can serve to orient the internal grid code. And then on the modeling side, whether the eigenvectors of SR can transfer reward information across the same environment, but rotated, sort of like in that teddy bear beach ball example. Okay, and then take over.
Yeah, maybe it's better to share my screen side, or are you going to do by myself?
I can click for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the second perspective, like adversarial position from the success representation, we call it infrastructure. So before I introduce this one, I just share my our original question. So we thought about that. Why is interesting question? Because that the grid code is known for that. It's helped us to navigate the physical space, but also we want to know that it can be more general code for representing the, and also representing and exploring the infrastructure of the knowledge in general. So for example, in here, actually you see that the spatial navigation examples in here, but also we want to, can you click the next one? Yeah, so we just want to see that whether it can be also extended to the non-spatial abstract task structure, like in here, the social network structure, for example. But also importantly, that one important question is that like a spatial navigation or the other example, they only testing with a continuous dimension, which means that when you're navigating and when you learn this map, actually you can actually get all the sensory feedback in the continuous dimension. So that's why you can actually learn the transition structure in the successive order. So it actually naturally allow you to having the successive representation. But actually, a lot of our knowledge or a lot of the decision making is based on the separate experiences that you have to sample from the discrete and the separate experiences, and you have to making one cohesive representation to making a new decision making. So we just want to know that can we generating this kind of map and use the same grid code for decision making. For example, in here, actually, you just randomly interact with the one people, the other people, and you have to combine them everything together into the one map. So that's the thing that we, as idea, we just say that, okay, it's not just the continuous transition structure or even continuous time or the sequences. It may be your own some infrastructure, maybe you having a representation, and grid code allow you to the navigating this your knowledge world. Click, yeah. And also we just want to ask the question that then this grid code can be useful for generalization in a novel problem. So I especially focusing on the generalization, the question in this way. So like you training, so you learning the structure from the one task, and can you using the same structure to solve the new problem in the totally different task that you did not learn before. So actually during the this last year, we're trying to answer this question. So we just do the non-spatial task learning with the discrete samplings, and we just training people from learning from the one task and apply to the different novel task. And we actually finding that in the fMRI studies, so it's not really the grid cell, but we just say that it's a grid like code representation is actually found in the human entorhinal cortex in fMRI, especially when you infer the unlearned social relationship. So yeah, you can check about this paper. So that is, we can say, is a kind of our achievement. And can you go next slide? Yeah, so so we realized that one of the benefit of this GAC process is it allows us to have a better question. So we actually thought about that we have a more common than the differences in the beginning, but actually we finding the differences actually comes from how you think about the representation. So we thought about that the infrastructure might be possible. We think that maybe the grid code is useful because you want to learn the new unlearned relationship through the old learned environment. Why is possible? We just borrowed a newly introduced the computational concept called the factorized representation. It means that when you learn the word, actually you learn the entities and also the structure in the different network. And they're combining into hippocampus, but also it's also easily can be separable. It means that you only using the structure code, and you can apply to learning the new environment to share the some similar structure, And in that case, you can using the same grid code, and also you can using the same policy to explaining some behavior or the making a decision kind of thing. So next one. So yeah, the important thing is then when and what making this the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex can share the same geometry, because the same geometry can be useful. It's supposed to be the mandatory condition to see that whether they're sharing the grid code or not. But actually, since this is abstract task, it is hard to see that when they're having the same geometrical representation, because we realize that even though the same task, the way of the representing the task can be multiple. So we need to know that when does the brain get the shared representation of the multiple task. Sorry. And also, since there's a multiple dimensions, but also the grid code allow us navigating like kind of 2D spaces, we want to know that how the multidimensional representation can be also used, and also how the dimensionality reduction is happening. And lastly, we want to also talk about that how the same environment can be represented differently in the individual, and how this one can explain the individual differences in the behavior. That's kind of the remaining but important questions. Yeah, so that's our presentation.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from either the audience or any of the other panelists? It looks like there's a comment in the chat about the grid code GAC. I'm reading this out for the purpose of the recording so that it's preserved. The grid code GAC needs to form a new GAC with the generalization GAC. You focus on grid code and entorhinal cortex. We focus on memory integration in the hippocampus. We are finding entorhinal cortex generalizing. We are finding hippocampus generalizing. Seems like a perfect GAC situation. So Dasa, if you'd like to follow up on that, if you raise your hand, I think I can give you a microphone if you are interested in following up. Otherwise, are there any other questions or comments from the panel or from the audience? Anybody?
I just want to maybe comment on, I thought it was really interesting to see how your initial sort of thoughts about the controversy changed once you started talking to each other. And I think this happens a lot in the field, where people just think that someone thinks something that they think, and if they don't talk, then they never figure it out, and everything is just based on empty assumptions. So this is one of the big positive aspects to me here. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, agreed. Songmin, did you want to chime in? I saw you unmute there. No?
Oh, no, I just say thank you.
Yes, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you. And I agree. I think that from what I've seen and heard about some of the other GACs, that this is a common theme, that half the battle is clarifying the vocabulary and the nature of the controversy. So hopefully we'll hear that come back up again as well in the rest of the update. So thanks very much, guys, and we'll have a panel discussion later. But for now, we can go on to the update from the next group, which is generalization of information, integrative encoding, or category-based inference. And I believe that Aurelio is going to give us the update there.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? All clear, slides there, good. Yeah, very nice to be here, basically 1 year later. And I think really jumping on the last comment, that once we start talking about the ideas and the theories, and we think the others think something, and then in the end we often actually realize that we're not that distant from each other in the way that we see, or in the way that we theorize those questions. So our group actually was in this kind of situation. So we started out with this idea to look at what are the two possible ways to generalize information. And generalization really quickly. It's just situations in which we can use previously learned evidence or experiences to predict a relevant behavioral outcome in a novel situation. And at the beginning, we said, okay, let's look at this in a simplified way and try to answer this from two different perspectives. One is like, okay, maybe generalization, the basis for it is really just combining memories or past episodes. And this is all you need to be able to predict future outcomes. On the other hand, we could also have, well, maybe you do have what we can call categories, concepts, or structures that you can use to infer some kind of latent variables across those previous experiences. And that was really our initial questions. Is generalization of information really coming from this integrative encoding? So we kind of integrating different memories together to have predictive power, or is it more a category-based inference? And then once we started discussing and talking and arguing, then we realized that, well, this does not. So first of all, both of those options are entirely possible. And those two alone might not even be the best way to look at how generalization of information happens. And so maybe it's more a better way to look at it, to answer what is generalization or what are the underlying mechanisms, is to think about it as whether the brain is doing a sort of on-the-fly computation, so basically essentially using a sort of exemplar, or whether it is a process, an integration process, which is sort of forming a sort of general representation, a kind of global representation that can be used again. So here I think, like, to summarize sort of what kind of came out of this year-long discussions, was that first of all, we found that there were clear challenges when we want to arbitrate between different ways of generalization. It's not only about our two initial sort of view that we set out. There's actually more than that. And one issue that we found as well was that, okay, we have generalization sometimes refers to mechanism, but sometimes to behavioral outcome, and that alone, of course, creates confusion now. And from there as well, what does and does not count as generalization is also not always agreed upon now. And finally, we have research that in different experimental species focuses on different questions. For example, we have some, maybe in humans, it's easier to run tasks in which the participants can exhibit flexible behavior, sort of learning can happen at much faster, much shorter time scales. In animal, we need often much longer training, and so this really has we found as a very strong impact in the kind of the tasks that are used to test generalization questions in the brain areas that are different studies have focused on. And because of this, then it's not really clear if in the end all this tap into the same or different underlying process or different underlying mechanism. But of course, we summarize this all in our position paper that now is available. It has been peer reviewed. It's fully available, and so you can further read there. But if you have to come into actually whether did we resolve any controversy or did those actually get deeper, I would say that of course not all were resolved just yet, but at least we have found ways to outline how to resolve this, to identify what could be probably candidate mechanisms, and really questions on our own current and future work, which I will briefly cover just after. But some of the questions also I think got deeper in the sense that to what extent, for example, generalization processes are different from memory processes, is something that we actually came to agree upon, and whether specifically some of us were really interested about functional categories. So these are categories that are not exactly based on perceptual similarities across the elements, but maybe by their functions. So for example, if you think of a credit card, a $10 bill or coins, these are very different perceptually, but they all have the same function to pay. and whether these kind of categories that we form are really different from the way that the brain forms standard perceptual categories. This as well, we didn't really come to an agreement. Why? But one of the reasons that we also realized that the more we discuss, the more we dig into the literature and both from the experimental and theoretical landscape, it's vast and there's a lot of blank areas. It's good as well for us because it means we have a lot of space for future work. But it was also a lot of gap and lack of standards in the terminology. So maybe in some studies they use a certain word define as a specific generalization process, but maybe in a different study the same terms are used to describe a behavior or a behavioral outcome. And so here is also how we said, okay, maybe good ways to go to answer specific questions that we set to allocate across our group. So one was, so are we all measuring the same generalization phenomena? Or if we think more specifically in terms of functional categorization, how does this arise in humans? Because previous studies had only looked at it essentially in animals. And what is the role of the prefrontal versus hippocampal regions in categorization, in functional categorization? Because again, most previous studies had only looked at it from the prefrontal point of view, and the hippocampus has sort of been ignored. So Dasha looked at the first question, so whether we're all measuring the same generalization phenomena, but from a viewpoint of testing a lot of subjects, so with a large scale individual different studies, and testing a lot of all those different tasks that are commonly used in generalization studies. So from associative inference paradigms, acquired equivalence, categorizations, transitive inference paradigms. This is ongoing, but preliminary results seems to indicate that there is definitely correlations across these tasks. But it's also true that these tasks correlate with standard memory tasks. So outcome in memory tasks that do not involve any generalization, essentially outcome. So sort of there must be some kind of underlying process that is really shared across memory and those generalizations. One interesting point was that the transitive inference seems to be kind of standing on its own. However, this might need further work because it is also the only task that really involves novel stimuli. And so it could be an effect, a stimulus effect. So sort of the take-home message here was that when we run generalization studies, it might be important really to also try to dissect or to isolate from what are the really associative memory processes, so that we can actually look into the actual underlying mechanism, whether we're talking about sort of like on the fly style generalization, or if it is something more based on again on memory, which is integrated memories and sort of like general representations. As for myself and Jesse, we went on to start this project using humans and fMRI to look at how do these functional categories, how they are learned and how they arise in the human brain now. So this is we designed this multi-session experiment. Maybe no need to go into details, but essentially the participants have to learn to associate arbitrary stimuli with color shapes in order to get rewards. And the way that we design, participants have to learn a limited set of associations, learning essentially overlearning them. In a second stage, they would learn many novel associations with new stimuli that they've never seen. And ideally, we would see that when they learn these new stimuli, first of all, they would be able to learn them, but this would not be immediate. And ideally, the representations at the neural level would allow us to tell how those new stimuli are treated. here I only have some preliminary behavioral results, but at least these look, I think, very nice in the sense that we see initially sort of this gradual learning of those basic associations. But once those are learned, learning any novel sort of stimulus associations happens very quick. So of course we see this dip in performance at the very beginning, but very quickly those can be integrated into the sort of this learn category. Sort of participants are essentially taking those new stimuli and really inputting it into an existing category, and that is why we can see sort of this high performances that are reached very quickly. And finally, the third question was monkey work, and this is led by Sergeant Pan and Masamichi Sagagami, looking into whether those functional categorization do need are mainly based on a sort of prefrontal mechanism, or whether the hippocampus is also involved. The reason for this question is because most of the generalization studies in humans do find, especially also Dasha's work, do find a very strong involvement of the hippocampus. But those previous studies in monkeys that have looked at this functional categorization have only looked at the prefrontal cortex, lateral prefrontal cortex. So I can't tell you much more of this because Masamichi has essentially not started yet the studies. So this will be hopefully piloted in the near future. But essentially, the idea would be to train monkeys to learn these functional categories, but in a way that those associations across stimuli are not only basically following a specific direction, but are both bidirectional and symmetrical, in the sense that the monkey may learn that the stimulus 1, stimulus A1 is associated with stimulus A2, but stimulus A2 also with A1. Taking novice stimuli, AN would be associated again with A1, but A1 with the AN. And hopefully we will hear from them in the near future. And that is all of it for our progress presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Aurelio. Do we have any questions from anybody in the audience or the panel? Not, I have a technical question, but or just a clarification question about the science, but I'll let other people go first if they want to. Anybody? Okay. Well, I will ask my very quick question then, which is about your question 2. I'm just wondering, the goal of the neural study is about looking for the similarity of the category representations using MVPA or something similar?
Yeah. Yes, sorry, I went very way too quickly with that. The reason also is because at the moment, all the results are very, investigation is very preliminary. We just basically started collecting the data. But yes, exactly. The goal of the neural part is to see whether once those novel stimuli start to be experienced, whether the representation, as we see the behavior, that very quickly the behavior we get very high performances. This presumes a sort of a mechanism that those novel stimuli are sort of immediately integrated into this existing structure. So the neural data that we can get with fMRI would allow us to tell whether this is actually the case. And a similarity analysis would be, for example, one way to go for it. Whether those representation of those novel stimuli quickly becomes similar to the previously learned stimuli, so to the one that I've learned in the initial sessions, as well as similarity with those color stimuli, which are the ones.
So you would expect this in later visual areas rather than earlier ones, because I would imagine that the earlier visual similarity is not going to change here. It's going to be about the functional representation, so something like almost PFC or at least ventral temporal. Okay. Yeah,
totally. I would not expect any change in the visual cortex in the early visual areas, although we might even see some. I think there's also recent work showing how the prefrontal cortex, especially when it's about there's like reward involved, kind of like reward-based learning, how this can exert a control on the sensory cortices. So I do not expect to see strong sort of signal changes there, but I would not be surprised if we do find actually something, even in visual, in early visual cortex.
Sure, yeah, and similar to like Byuha's work about like the PFC kind of doing top-down control in ambiguous situations and so on to kind of resolve that meaningful difference. Cool, so thank you very much. I could ask lots more questions about science, but I think we should probably move on. But if you do have any questions about the science, of course, please put them in the Q&A. We will have time for chat later. And so now we will move on to the third GAC update, which is the competing theories of probabilistic computations in the brain. And I believe this is Ralf and Zach, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Hey, Zach. Zach's in charge of the first half of the presentation. Oh,
yeah,
there he is.
Sorry, I just had to transfer cat to cat carrier for the vet. Okay, sharing screen. And let's see.
Luckily, you've got the right tab open already.
But what's that? You already found a typo?
No, don't worry.
Okay, good. So thanks again to the GAC organizers for putting together such a cool idea of something to do here. And we are, I think, the laggards of the group. We still haven't submitted our paper yet, but that's because we've been hard at work hammering out a lot of interesting details. So the group here comprises Jeff Beck, Ralf Haefner, me, Zach Pitkow, Christina Savin, and Esther Vertes. And we are thinking about different theories of probabilistic computations in the brain. So the original title was Competing Theories of Probabilistic Computations in the Brain. And the scientific question was, how does neural activity represent probability distributions? And how are probabilistic computations implemented in neural circuits? And the major controversy that we were trying to address is that we had different advocates for different representations, including PPCs, DDCs, and sampling. And PPCs stands for probabilistic population codes, and DDCs stands for distributed distributional codes, and sampling is sampling. Sometimes people call it sampling-based codes, or SBCs, but I prefer fewer acronyms where possible. There's also a side controversy with the other group that we'll hear from later, which is whether it's even correct to think about the brain as representing probabilities. So there's some meta GAC action there. So what did we do? First, we remained friends despite some substantial obstacles. This is part of the goal here, is to have a collegial dispute over different ways of thinking about things and how we can actually make progress. And so it's been fun, and we've had a lot of entertaining and sometimes heated discussions, but all of that worked very well. Ralf is opening up his video because maybe you want to say something? No? Okay. We agreed on the problem, which is a fantastic beginning. And in particular, what are the necessary parts of any theory of this type? So you have to actually specify what the elements are. And so we put together this diagram, which kind of summarizes the main ingredients that you need. And so let's pay attention to the left first. So naming the variables, as we'll talk about, turned out to be an interesting problem. But there's a world out there. And so you can see my cursor, right? Okay, so there's a world out there, we'll call that S. Nobody ever knows what the world is. Everything is through observations, but we have some actual S that generates some observations that we get, which are O. And then this is not, by the way, a graphical model. This is just a diagram of things that are related to each other. There's parts that are kind of a graphical model. So then you get your observations, your brain gets some observations, and those observations come into play in two different ways. The one that we're most concerned about is the approximate posterior Q. And the interesting thing here is that it's Q of Z, not Q of S. And it's Q of Z given O. So we call it Q because it's approximate. It's not a true, not necessarily a true probability. Sometimes we'll say, well, okay, if the brain is really doing the best possible thing and there are no approximations, we will promote it to P. But for now it's Q. And it's conditioned on observations. And this could be a time series of observations, although we focus primarily on a static task. And then that key variable there, Z, which is the brain's model of the latent variables. It's which latent variables the brain is making a posterior over. And that is not necessarily the world state. So there could be a really important discrepancy between what Z is and what S is. So different groups and different models have focused on different aspects of Z, like maybe for images, let's say, some people in PPCs proposed originally that Z was the orientation of some angle. And this, you could say, well, maybe that's part of the world. There's an experimentalist out there turning some knob, which is rotating some image. And then sampling people said, well, no, these are actual latent states that you can, or latent variables that you add together in some way to construct the original image. Like you have to explain all of O based on some set, all of the observations based on your latent variables. So these are different perspectives. Now, when we talk about Q, the probability aspect of that, first of all, it's approximate. So it needs, in order to be an approximate probability, it needs to obey some certain laws. And it has to represent more than just the best guess. It needs to have some measure of uncertainty. That's sort of a minimum condition. But all of those uncertainties are constructed in the context of a generative model, which is what kind of things typically happen. It's like a prior that explains what is the distribution of your latent variables and the distribution of observations jointly, so that you can create an approximate posterior which would perform inference. And then, so that's the inference. It's connecting the generative model with the posterior. You got to specify that in order to make sense of this approximate posterior at all. And then that posterior is getting learned. The generative model is getting learned, and that's also dependent on the observations. So then all of that is very abstract, and it's referencing the external world, at least some elements of it. But the mechanism that is the lower level below the dotted lines, which are the neural activity and the synaptic weights. And these are the things that implement whatever algorithm we're talking about. And so the relationship between the posteriors and the activity might be, we can call it representation. And then the thing that is implementing changes in the generative model that does the learning is the plasticity. So all of this in the diagram, we needed to come to some consensus about because we have different notions of what was critically important. And along the way, there are these three crucial types of dynamics, which are reflecting the computations that happen. And so at the earliest stage, you have sequential observations, data comes in over time. And so that changes the way, like what is the thing, what is the evidence over time? You might even have latent variables that are time dependent. So related to that, the change in Q, the change in your posterior, that's the algorithm. So even if you fix your observations, you fix your latents, you might have some mental computations that get you from the observations to your Q, and those dynamics are the algorithm. And then the generative model itself can change. And so that would be learning, and that's P dot. So these core concepts are something that we spent a long time trying to get something unified that explains all this stuff. And so we agreed on a shared language, which is related to this. So we have a table of notation where we're now using the same terms for the same things. And here are the things that matter. So for example, we can also add concept of nuisance variables, which is some component, some latent variables in the world that are not task relevant. And then you can have, and so we call that external noise. And then there's internal noise, which is like neural noise, which people usually talk about. So this is an important contribution as well. Where possible, we tried to keep these things mnemonic to some degree. We don't have everything in here. We simplified, like, for example, action and policy are things that are important for all of these as well. And we, with all of that shared language, we've summarized each proposal for these competing theories in a unified format, which asks questions like, what is Z? What are O? What is Q? And I think this is where Ralf is going to take over and talk about one example of that.
Cool. Thanks, Zach. So yes, and you know, as Zach pointed out, that was a large part of what we were you know, busy doing. But I think it's also really important because it helps us make really explicit every little part that matters. So for instance, here for the example of neurosampling, you know, we've organized this slide. Maybe Zach, you can still use your mouse when it's helpful. You know, in terms of like, what are the key questions? And that's how we organized the paper too. Like, what is R in this particular case of neurosampling? And that's just one flavor. That's important to note that these theories, sampling, DDCs, PPCs come in different flavors. It is membrane potentials, so on the left, and they are then mapped some linear transformation into the latent space. So Z is M times R, and any point, any combination of membrane potentials at any point in time corresponds to one particular point in Z space, a sample. And then over time, that maps out a trajectory in that latent space. And that trajectory implies a distribution Q, where all the probability mass lies on this trajectory, and you know, equal amount of probability mass, which then hopefully will, you know, approximate the P, the posterior P of Z given O that the brain is trying to compute. Now, this is one particular flavor of sampling, right, where the R's and the Z's are continuous, but a pretty, you know, qualitatively different looking one, but still sampling, is given in the bottom row, where the assumption is that the latent variables that the brain has learned are best conceptualized or formalized as binary variables. And the neural responses are that we should really, you know, measure and account for are spikes and not membrane potentials, or not spike rates, but spikes. So the absence and presence of a spike, which then gets mapped into latent space by converting a spike in a particular time bin into a 1 and the absence of a spike into a 0. So then at every point in time, over time, that maps out a trajectory or sequence of samples that consists of binary vectors. And building histogram over them over some counting window yields an approximate or a distribution, a Q, that's meant to be, or that's hopefully an approximation of the posterior P of Z given O that the brain is trying to compute, right? So these are two, you know, pretty different proposals, but by specifying all the individual parts, you know, it allows us to A, argue about them, and B, just, you know, understand them. And I think all of us, you know, in our GAC learned quite a bit about the implicit or not so implicit assumptions, maybe hidden in the method section on the other side. Okay, so one of the goals, some relationships, exactly. So having done that, right, and characterize and describe these different proposals, we then try to own in on the key aspects, their essence, and the relationships between them, like the similarities and their differences. So the next figure is just gives you a taste of what we try to do. So for instance, here on the left-hand side, you know, all the proposals have some, you know, neural responses that they're trying to describe. On the right-hand side, all these proposals, you know, have some kind of, you know, approximate probability distribution Q. But how they're related, obviously, is very different. Now, for the case of PPCs and DDCs, it's a linear combination, M times R, linear combination of neural responses that provides the weights to a set of basis functions, T of Z, that are defined over latent space. And in the case of a linear PPC, you know, this combination determines the logarithm of the approximate posterior, while in the case of a DDC, it produces the posterior directly. Now, for the case of sampling, it's different in the sense that the approximate distribution is also again a combination of T's, but now the neural responses live inside the argument of those kernels, and so in the same space. Anyway, we also talked a lot about the similarities in terms of the computations, but that's still more work in progress. And I see Gunnar come up. Give me just 2 minutes to finish. Maybe next slide. So the final goal really, or the eventual goal, was to come up with experiments that can distinguish between them. But so far, like a preliminary minimal agreement is that we really need to specify all the moving parts, even if that means making strong assumptions about things that we have very little knowledge about. In particular, what's Z and how are Z and O related. Okay, so next steps. Most importantly, we still owe the community a position paper. We haven't forgotten about that. That's top of our list. For that paper, we hope to make a little bit more progress on experimental tests. But probably beyond that paper, we also want to talk about, we are still hoping to find some predictions of the different theories that are agnostic to some of the underlying assumptions. And eventually we hope to submit a collaborative grant proposal to work on this together. All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. We're kind of running a little late, so if there's any questions, I encourage everyone to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and then I'm sure that Ralf and Zach would be happy to answer them in the chat or in the Q&A, or maybe later if there's some time. But for the sake of time, I'd suggest we move on to the next group. That is perception probabilistic, so very much related. And Doby, you're presenting. If you want to share your screen, the floor is yours.
See that? You can hear me as well?
Yep.
Wonderful. All right, so this is going to be an extremely short update because I think for a couple of reasons. One is I think our team sort of really took it as like just progress, like very brief. But the other thing is that we have been going back and forth on a lot of the things that we've been discussing. So I think our update is really still in flux. So just as a brief overview, we're a team of 4 people. 2 of us think that perception is probabilistic, and 2 of us, at least originally, thought that perception is probabilistic, and 2 of us originally thought that perception is not probabilistic. That very much depends on the definition of what is probabilistic perception, and that's going to come up and again. And depending on what we end up with as the definition of probabilistic perception, that's still in flux, that those teams may change. So what is the progress that we have made so far? We have really gone back and forth on the definition of probabilistic perception. So when I say we have gone back and forth, I mean we agreed on something, we wrote the whole paper, then we realized we disagree, then we wrote another thing, then we disagreed again. So it was really a long process, and we have spent just an extraordinary amount of time discussing this issue. And I think one of the things that we have just really appreciated is the problem of trying to figure out something that does not have an explicit definition in the literature. So so part of solving the problem is defining the problem, and that's not a place you want to be in. I think that's something that I think other groups face to some extent, but I think we face it to a much greater extent than most. So current consensus may have changed as about an hour ago, which is sort of a weird thing to say after 1 year. But so the stage that we're at, we submitted the paper. We ended up writing a paper where each of the two groups just wrote our positions. We tried to make it as clear as possible after the main discussions we had, but they were pretty much just two positions side by side, and that was it. We got commentaries, and we have been discussing those commentaries and sort of follow up since then. And we just had a meeting where things may have changed just one more time, but I'm not going to get there at this point because I think things are just too much in flux. So I think along the way, we have clarified a couple of issues that were not necessarily clear in the beginning. One is that the complexity of the information that is available is a separate issue from where perception, where this information is probabilistic. So early on, when we did the workshop, we pretty much had those two things as equivalent. So the way we were thinking about it, at least some of us, maybe myself, was that the question is about how complex the information is, and that complex information must be probabilistic versus simpler representations must be non-probabilistic. And we have come to agree that this is not a correct link to make, as in complex information may be non-probabilistic and simple information could be probabilistic. So these are separate issues. They're not unrelated, they're related, but they're separate. Another thing that we have agreed on is that the current evidence is consistent with the uncertainty being derived from proper probabilistic computations. This is sort of a phrase that I just came up with. So it sort of suggests that the computations are base optimal, or they're the proper thing you should be doing mathematically. But the current evidence is also consistent with computational heuristics, which is something that is not the proper thing, but it is related to the proper thing in one way or the other. Now, these two things we're still in discussing. Where is the line between them, and is there really a line between them? Is there a line between a proper probabilistic computations and computational heuristics? So this is still very much in flux as well. Okay, so how did the collaboration change our thinking? I would say that we have a much better appreciation for the gap that exists between the way people use the same words. So things like probabilistic and the word uncertainty are things that we realize we're using in very different ways. And I mean, we realized early on that this is the case, but even then it's been difficult to come up with sort of a joint vocabulary here. And I think the collaboration has pushed us to think about big picture questions like, how can we as experimenters ever know what computation the brain performs? I think we have come to appreciate that even if we know exactly what the brain is doing, like at the implementational level, like 100% we know how each neuron fires, there may still be a question of like whether it is appropriate to label this as probabilistic or non-probabilistic, which is an issue. So then another thing is, even if we agree on what the brain does, is it possible that we disagree on the labels? So this is a related question. And third, what is the level of complexity of the perceptual information that is available downstream? So again, this is not the same as is perception probabilistic, but a very much related question. So plans for the future. We want to agree on whether the disagreement is just about the labels or about the essence. I think this is very much still in flux. I think we thought it was really about the essence, and I think our last meeting sort of swung that back to the disagreement being about labels, and this is very different, right? So do we agree on what the brain does and we just disagree on how to label it, or do we disagree on what the brain does? So, first order of business, agree on that. Then finish the paper, hopefully get commentaries. And, the goal of this was always to design and perform experiments. Obviously, that is very much contingent on two things. First is, it should be the disagreement is about more than labels. If it is about labels, then there's no experiments to be done. And I think that's still helpful to write that. It's been a long journey for us to discuss all of that stuff. And if it is about labels, I think that would be really good for us to clarify, and we would then save a lot of time with arguing for things that we don't actually disagree on. But if it is not just about labels, then I still hope that we can design in the future experiments. So this is my brief update. I think all of the other members are here, so if anybody wants to chime in and correct me on any of these things or add stuff, feel free to do so.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments?
Is there some assessment of what probabilistic means at this point? Do you have like your best current assessment?
Yeah, so again, I think this changed as of an hour ago, and I'm just not comfortable saying this is our current assessment. But I think it actually
is a sample. It's sampled from a distribution of assessments.
The latest sample from the distribution is that it's actually quite a bit related to what you were saying. So I was very happy to see that sort of agreement. So that idea of a Q where it's not necessarily a full probability distribution or a proper probability distribution. It may not even satisfy all of the requirements of being a probability, the three laws of probability, but it has more than a mean. It has some notion of uncertainty that correlates with a proper derivation of uncertainty. So that would be what probabilistic is. Now, if that is what probabilistic is, I would then say that the disagreement is about labels, because I then think that perception is probabilistic. I think we always, so Ned and I had a stronger idea of what probabilistic should be, that it has to satisfy the three laws of probability, and it has to be, we need to have some evidence that the brain specifies probability distributions rather than the experiment that specifies probability distributions, and then see some correlates of that in the brain.
Cool, thank you.
But if I can chime in, these are two separate issues, right? One is the approximation issue. How far away from some true or some reference distribution can you be to still be called probabilistic? And there must be some tolerance there, because we know it can't be exact. So, I think that hypothesis is out the window already. So it must be approximate. So maybe you could then define, okay, how approximate are you happy with? Like a single sample, like one estimate probably wouldn't satisfy your criteria. It's a separate question from the other one. How do you relate, or how do you test a hypothesis about a distribution inside the brain if maybe what only thing you have access to is a distribution outside the brain? But these seem to be two conceptually different questions that might be worth figuring out for more philosophically minded people.
Yeah, and I think that issue of how far does it have to be in order to stop being probabilistic, that's the thing that we have been discussing, especially in this last meeting a lot. And it just, there's no way to solve this properly, right? I think as long as there's a correlation, there's a correlation. Like you have to call it probabilistic if you're going down that route.
But then maybe a more meaningful question. Maybe you should just change the question, right? How approximate is what the brain is doing, right? If you know 0 on one end, 1 is perfect, where is the brain? Couldn't be turned into a measurement question.
I agree. On some level, I agree, and we can definitely discuss that. The issue is, what is the scale, or what is the axis on which we're going close or far? I mean, I think all of you guys who believe in probabilistic perception, none of you think it's exact, right? So I guess, yeah, we can just say, oh, how far is it? But I don't know if anybody feels very strongly. It's like, oh, it's like 5% away versus 20% away. What does that even mean? Yeah. Anyway, we can definitely think about whether that can be formalized in some way that can be discussed meaningfully. I'm just not very optimistic about it right now.
It sounds like you guys should definitely talk. There's a lot of overlap there in terms of thinking and conceptualization. Great. If there's no other question, I think we should carry on for the next one. So the next group is about biological recurrent neural networks and learning and flexibility of learning in them. Who's presenting? Is it Joe? Yeah. No, your audio is super low. Could you check the gain of your microphone?
Yeah, we can hear you, but you're very tiny.
So
You're
typically
in a
you
parallel
can change
universe.
the gain, just like pull it up somehow.
Yeah.
It wouldn't let you. Oh.
If you turn off the automatic gain, maybe. I don't know. There's like a checkbox that says adjust gain automatic.
Oh, here we go. Is that better?
Now it's really loud. That's okay. Yeah, much better, I think.
Okay, it won't automatically adjust, so I might be loud and quiet now and again. Is that okay?
This is sort of
more
okay.
would be good.
Could be, yeah, slightly more would be great, but this we can
Here?
definitely hear you. Yeah.
Is that
awesome.
okay? Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Cool. The floor is
so
all
I will
yours.
share my screen. So I'll be talking about biological recurrent neural networks, in particular learning in biological recurrent neural networks, or recurrent neural networks in general. And that problem is often called the temporal credit assignment problem. And a bunch of us attended this talk last year. Franz unfortunately had to go just now, so I'll be presenting it by myself. Right, so what is temporal credit assignment? Well, temporal credit assignment, I think neuroscientists often reduce temporal credit assignment to synaptic plasticity in recurrent circuits. So what kind of changes, what kind of weights, changes in your recurrent weights on your synapses do you want to optimize some kind of performance? So we spoke a lot about that, but we also asked ourselves, well, is there more to the brain, or is there more to learning than synaptic plasticity? For example, perhaps architecture's not looked at it as much, or perhaps internal dynamics of neurons and those kind of things. We also spoke about quite a contentious issue in neuroscience, which is whether the brain has some kind of objective function. So for those of you who are familiar with machine learning, usually there's some kind of teacher, or in the case of supervised learning, or there's some kind of explicit reward that is encoded by the brain, but it's not so clear where or how this could be encoded in a biological neural circuit. So we spoke about different kind of learning signals, perhaps self-supervised, intrinsically generated. And we also talked about what experimentalists, the problems facing experimentalists, the questions they should try and answer in temporal credit assignment, and their limitations. I'm no experimentalist myself, but I get the impression that recording a synapse, let alone a neuron, is pretty damn hard, and trying to identify plasticity is not easy. So a lot of the weight might fall on computationalists to come up with some predictions that can be readily tested by experimentalists rather than the other way around. Okay. Yeah, so it's a huge challenge. I think it's a challenge to monitor, one synapse, to monitor multiple in a neural population would be super challenging. Okay, so I think in our meeting, I think there were actually quite large agreements, at least compared to maybe some of you guys' chats. This is probably best illustrated by the audience panel. So here we are. So we've got some main questions. So I'll go through the ones that people strongly agreed on first. So I thought this was an interesting one. I didn't think this would be anywhere near so accepted, but it's generally accepted that the brain should estimate gradients through time, or at least it's important for the brain to estimate gradients through time. This kind of goes together with right, or it's probably a bit stronger than what's on the right, so that plasticity is necessary for learning and memory. And people believed, well, along with those two, that there are potential biological mechanisms for estimating gradients through time. So the bit where opinion was a bit more split is whether this gradient information would be estimated locally at the neuron and the synapse, or whether there are more global signals, and whether sometimes pre-wired recurrent circuits could be enough by themselves, and you don't actually need much plasticity. Okay, so with regards to these points, well, what's happened in the past year? I've cherry-picked a few examples, but there have been even more computational models of backpropagation through time. So backpropagation through time, if you don't know, is just an equivalent, well, it's backpropagation basically in the temporal domain of recurrent neural networks. And if people think backpropagation is implausible, well, backpropagation through time is like would be kind of impossible. It's generally thought of as highly implausible in the brain, and alternatives would be required. And lots of computationalists come up with such alternatives. There's been a neat one that's come up this year, which mixes locally computed eligibility traces with some kind of cell type modulatory signals. And this produces pretty competitive performance, even with backpropagation through time. And there's also this growing idea that neurons can separately encode gradients without affecting their feed-forward, without affecting feed-forward dynamics. So there's this idea that actually bursting is specialized in neurons as a learning signal, which would then promote plasticity. But people have also looked beyond synaptic plasticity. There's been some papers on optimal microcircuit architecture, actually looking at the probabilities of connections between neurons and how an optimal kind of circuit already gives a strong foundation for learning. So this is kind of innate computational ability of a recurrent circuit at birth, for example. People have also looked at different kinds of objective functions compared to standard supervised learning ones. So there's been this completely locally computed self-supervised learning rule, which only takes information extremely near the synapse. I think in this paper, this would be used, for example, as pre-processing of some image or some kind of audio to allow future layers to learn better from, for example. And on the experimental side, there's growing work, or there's growing technology in really trying to pin down neural activities or synaptic activities during learning. And there's even this new technology where someone here probably knows this technology better than me, but from my understanding, you kind of put these artificial glutamate receptors onto a neuron, And these will, one, be able to identify activity at the synapse, but also it should be able to identify which synapses have undergone plasticity during learning. So I think the idea is that once you've identified synapses that have learned, you can then consider that neurocircuit in vitro and see what kind of and try and identify what might have caused that plasticity. So toy around, try and hopefully find a kind of parent neuron which seems to have caused the plasticity in the first place. Okay, so looking ahead in the future, what should we try and do? Well, for computationalists, carry on expanding, coming up with new models and expand the model space. These models, though they should be, they should be concrete computational models, but they should also be experimentally testable, and it's very important they respect the time and space complexity and limitations of neural circuits. And vitally, forgetting about any biological implementation, these models should be able to solve non-trivial tasks in silico, so on your machine. The models should have some theoretical justification and computational ability by themselves, and then analyze any differences and commonalities amongst these computational approximations, and try and see what best fits neural behavior and data. Okay, so for experimentalists, to complement these, ideally, we consider natural animal tasks, but those which are analogous to machine learning tasks. And these tasks, importantly, they should be complicated enough to require more than a simple linear, feed-forward readout. So we actually want to try and engage recurrent plasticity here. Good kind of tasks for these might be working memory or path integration tasks, where usually a linear readout, at least in machine learning, isn't enough. And yeah, speaking about that kind of technology in the last slide, if we can concurrently record somatic and dendritic potentials during learning, it should help computationalists a lot. But of course, as with all science, it's a joint effort here between theorists and experimentalists moving forward. And that's the end.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. Are there any comments, questions for Joe and his team, of course? Well, people are thinking, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So
yeah,
a lot of this gradient-based stuff,
yeah,
if it's gradient-based, it implies that you can't have any curl. You can't like swirl around and come back to the same synaptic weights. So is there some thinking that there needs to be something beyond a single objective function in order to explain anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question.
Like a vector potential or something?
I've never considered. I'm not sure if you kind of get this curl naturally in tasks. If you maybe go back to the same examples, maybe you stay with some input space at the start, and then you evolve as you get new inputs, and then you go back as you see future ones. I would just be guessing though. It's not something I know about.
I mean, this is one thing that's been reported in like continuous attractors or like having multiple fixed points, that maybe even short-term plasticity leads it to leave a given state. And so then it flows to another state. Right? If you get short-term depression, then the attractor is no longer stable and it can move somewhere else. So you can have a constant flow, circulating flow of synaptic weights, which would mean that it's not a gradient.
What, via short-term plasticity? Via short-term plasticity, there's this constant flow.
Yeah, and therefore the whole dynamics of the gradient of the synaptic weights are not necessarily gradient-based.
Yeah,
maybe there's you can decompose it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think in this talk we're really focusing on long-term plasticity.
Yeah, I'm not using short-term as the exclusive way that could happen. That's just one concrete way.
What as a way synaptic weights?
Plasticity could have curl. As a way it could have curl.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway.
Yeah. No. I've not got much knowledge on that.
Any other questions? I wonder to what degree you think that the cortical architecture might play a role. So you talked about different types of spike patterns, right? Like the bursting versus regular spiking, they potentially have different functions. But then the actual cortical architecture is much more complicated than the typical, even spiking neural network models that people build, where maybe you have two different populations, an excitatory and inhibitory, but that's about it typically, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. Cortical microcircuits are way more complicated than artificial recurrent networks. People have come up with crazy models, layers 1 to 5, and how each of them specialize in different things. And inhibitory and excitatory is not generally modeled in like typical, artificial recurrent neural networks unless it's really specializing for that particular thing. I think for these harder tasks, these non-trivial tasks, I think people are trying to treat it at a higher level, I suppose, and saying, okay, well, a recurrent network of spiking is still a recurrent network of spiking neurons. Yeah, we're getting loads of details, but it's a place to start.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we have one more progress update for all of you, and then after this one and the Q&A period, we will take a short break, and then we'll come back for a meta level discussion about what worked and what didn't work about the collaborations. But first, we have our last GAC from last year, which is about linear models in cognitive neuroscience and whether the simplicity of linear models is oversimplified. And so it looks like, Anna, you're going to be giving this presentation. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, great. Take it away.
All right. So yeah, our GAC title is Linear Mapping Models in Cognitive Neuroscience. Our team is Leila Ishik, Martin Shrimp, Stefana Anzalotti, Nama Zaslavsky, F. Fedorenko, and me, Anna Ivanova. We come from MIT, Johns Hopkins, and Boston College. So what is our GAC about? Well, it's about mapping models in cognitive neuroscience. And I'm going to start by telling you what we mean by this. So let's say we have a brain and we want to understand how it works. To do so, we might want to record neural activity in a particular part of the brain. And so now our goal is to interpret this activity. And one way in which we can approach this task is by relating the signal that we've measured to some other variable that we care about. And the form that this variable can take will vary. Maybe we are measuring the brain response to some stimuli we're presenting, and so we care about the category of the stimulus, like faces, body parts, or objects. Maybe we want to relate activity in this brain region to activity in a specific layer of a neural network that is thought to be performing a similar task. Maybe we want to relate activity in this brain region to activity in a different brain region, or to the behavior of the owner of the brain as they're performing a particular task. And in all of these cases, the specific decision that the researcher has to make is what is the space of mappings we are willing to consider. And the space of mappings is determined by the choice of a mapping model. So to formalize it just a little bit, we can call the variable of interest X and the measured signal Y. And so what we care about is the space of functions that can link X and Y. And so one simple solution is to say, well, we're going to only consider linear functions. So we're going to use a linear mapping model. But of course, that's not the only choice we can make. We can also consider certain non-linear functions like a polynomial, a logarithmic function, an exponential, and many, many, many more. Or we can choose a mapping model like a multi-layer perceptron that can actually approximate pretty much any function between X and Y. And so the key question we asked as this GAC is, well, should we go beyond linear mappings, right? So most commonly in the studies today, people just resort to a linear mapping model. And so the question is this choice justified? So what did we decide? We had multiple discussions within the team. We had a discussion with the community during the proposal review stage and the workshop. And what we concluded briefly is that the choice of the mapping model depends really strongly on particular research goals and what the researcher wants to accomplish with their mapping model. And this might sound pretty obvious to you, but actually, I think it isn't in the practice. And let me make this a little bit more concrete. So most people, when asked about why they're making the mapping model choices that they're making, refer to 3 different high-level desiderata that they use during modeling. One is predictive accuracy. People want to build models that explain all or most of the variance in their signal. The second one is interpretability. So some researchers point out that they don't just want to build a model that predicts well, but also a model where the mapping that results is interpretable. And then the third desideratum is biological plausibility. We want to not only interpret the mapping, but also in some cases, we want the mapping to reflect something we already know about the brain. And different people place different weights on these different desiderata. After further discussion, we actually figured out that researchers might mean very different things when they say either one of those desiderata. Actually, they are not one and the same, but they all incorporate a bunch of research goals or sub-goals. For predictive accuracy, what people might actually want to do is compare competing feature sets or the code features from neural data, or just build maximally accurate models of brain activity. For interpretability, some people want to examine individual features that they use during the mapping process. So others want to examine the representational spaces that are defined by these features, and others are happy with just describing the feature set as a whole. For biological plausibility, there are also at least 2 categories. One is the desire to simulate the neural readout that might be performed by a downstream brain region, and the other is to incorporate physiological properties of the measurement. And so if we look at what researchers are doing when they try to pursue each one of those goals, we see that today, for the vast majority of these goals, people are using linear mappings for better or for worse. And only in a few cases do they try or at least consider non-linear mapping models as well. And an important insight that we had at this stage is that for a lot of these goals, not all, but a lot of them, what people actually want to have is not a linear mapping, but a simple mapping. So people are using linearity as a proxy for simplicity. And so what we can do is we can actually reframe this problem and move beyond the linear non-linear dichotomy to a continuous scale, on one end of which we have research goals where we really want low complexity mappings. We want the mapping to be as simple as possible. On the other end, we have models with high complexity mappings where we don't care about how complex the mapping is, we still reach our research goal. And then in the middle, we have goals where we might want to put some specific restrictions on the complexity, but allow complexity to vary in some other dimensions. And so by reframing the problem, we were able to, first of all, come to a place of agreement as a group, or at least some agreement. I think we all generally agree with this different formulation instead of this linear nonlinear dichotomy. And also we hope to encourage practitioners to really examine the mapping model choices that they're making through the lens of complexity, instead of just resorting to linear models as this like simple, good for all solution. So what did we learn in the process of going through this year together as a GAC team? First of all, we realized how important it is to define and refine our definitions. And for example, it was really important for us to distinguish between a model of brain function, so a computational model that tries to mimic something that the brain does, and a mapping model that is just a way to fit a variable of interest and a neural recording. The second big outcome was the ability to survey opinions in the field during the open review process, as well as the workshop itself. We had external speakers. We really went through the reviews that we got. And I think this was really instrumental for us to understand why people in the community are making the modeling choices that they're making. The third outcome was identifying and sometimes challenging the assumptions that we and the rest of the field had about these issues. For example, people commonly equate linear models with interpretable models and non-linear models with non-interpretable models. But as Jean-Remy King and some others pointed out, it's actually a false equivalence. You can have linear non-interpretable models and non-linear interpretable models. So it was really important for us to dissociate cases like this. And then, of course, the goal of the GAC is to have people with different opinions come together and come to a consensus. And we think we did. And so this is reflected in our opinion piece that we are currently revising. This title might change. This is still in progress. And so I think definitely this is a cool outcome of this process, having this position piece out there, almost having it out there. And we also wrote a smaller opinion piece applying some of those same ideas to artificial neural networks. So what's next for our team, what we hope or aspire to achieve, I guess, is first of all to implement and test a pipeline for actually measuring model complexity, mapping model complexity. And once we have that, we can go ahead and evaluate mapping models of varying complexity on several representative data sets to see how well they perform in practice rather than just in theory. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic, thank you. So do we have any comments or questions from the audience or from the other panelists? I'll make a comment, which is I'm really enjoying seeing the same themes come out in terms of, you know, it turns out that half of the battle was dealing with the terminology differences or clarifying our thinking about this and getting us all on the same page. And so we're going to have, I hope, a lot more of that in the panel discussion that is coming up in the second half of this session. But I think that is a huge outcome here, is that recognizing where the challenge really lies, whether it's terminological, whether it's conceptual, and building a shared vocabulary so that you can even continue to argue about this stuff is very nice to see throughout all of these. I also love that everyone is planning to continue working on this, and that there are these big plans to do new experiments for everybody. So I know this isn't a comment just on yours, Anna, but it's a comment on all of them. This is fantastic. Do we have any other comments or questions from the audience about this particular update, or about any of the updates actually, before we take a very short break and then we come back for a panel discussion and kind of a meta level conversation?
Maybe if I may comment, one of the other themes to me that stood out is that a lot of the GAC started sort of like having or thinking they had a clear separation between different ideas and hypotheses, and not just was there some groundwork to be done in terms of sort of vocabulary and actual thinking, what is meant, but also it seems that often in cases it was like a lot of the controversies were like in the subtleties of, you know, assumptions, or so Anna talked about, you know, the confound between linear versus interpretable and nonlinear versus non-interpretable and things like that. And I think there was some of those in other GACs as well. And so I thought that was also very helpful, sort of not just to find common ground in terms of vocabulary and in terms of thinking, but also to sort of actively discuss assumptions that are implicitly made in the field, or like sort of or run into them and discover them through the discussion of the more subtle aspects of agreement or disagreement. So I thought that was something that I didn't personally anticipate, and I thought it was very interesting to see.
If I can,
we have a quick question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, someone else. Just on this point of Gunnar, I mean, I think much of scientific communication is via publications, right? And it's an incredibly tiny bottleneck. And the assumptions can, at least, I don't know, in our field, probabilistic computations, differ quite fundamentally between different labs. And so, you know, systematically talking about this and really trying to get to the bottom and understanding and making it all explicit, I think what was a really big part, and it's really important. And, you know, and I think the more specialized that, you know, any field gets, the more there's a divergence and the more there's a need, I think, for this.
Absolutely. We have a quick clarification or kind of content-based question from Dasa in the chat for Anna. Any favorite nonlinear mappings that seem more fruitful than others?
Yeah, well, it really depends on the specific question you're pursuing. One that I am personally familiar with is nonlinear models in fMRI. So a few people are working on this, but in particular, Corey Shane in my lab, developed this continuous time deconvolutional regression approach, which is a very constrained, is a pretty constrained model, right? It doesn't just like allow you to consider all possible mappings, it just allows you to estimate the HRF via a few parameters. And so I think that's an example where we know there are nonlinearities in how neural activity evokes fMRI bold response. We know that it differs across brain regions and across individuals. Let's just go ahead and explicitly incorporate this into our mapping model and have a parameter that can allow us to estimate it. So just one example.
Fantastic. Great. So I think we should maybe take a short break here, just a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we're going to have a lot more of this meta level discussion. And if there are any other folks also in the audience who are part of the GACs who want to be pulled into the panel, this is really meant to be more of a back and forth chat. We have a few slides that all of the GACs have prepared that are about kind of the challenges that they faced and the lessons that they've learned through doing this collaborative endeavor, that with the premise that it starts with people who disagree fundamentally, maybe. And so we'll start with those slides, but that'll go pretty quickly, and then we'll just have a hopefully great discussion. So let's take a short break, and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes. Okay. All right, great. I'm going to put up a break slide here just so that we can have that going. All right, we'll see you all in about 5 minutes. right, folks, we'll get started in a minute or so here if we've got all our panelists back. I know 5 minutes is pretty fast, but just, we don't want to waste too much time here. All right. So what I'm going to do is I will put up this slide. So we're going to start with, as people kind of filter back into the room here, let me do this. And you can just see the slides here, right? Looks good. Okay. So I think we're just waiting for a couple more minutes. So we've got Doby, Zach's here. Can we get a camera on or a wave or something from some of the other panelists so that we can know whether we go? There we go. Hey guys. Okay, so I think we can probably go ahead and get going. We want to leave enough time for the discussion, including, again, the folks from the audience. Please be part of this. This is meant to be an open discussion about what we think we can do better in the future and what worked really well. And the reason is that we've got 4 new GACs starting this year, and some of them have already had their kickoff workshops, and some of those kickoff workshops are still upcoming. And I encourage everyone to go to those. Those are going to be, I think, really fun and exciting. But let's talk about what worked and what didn't work. And so we have one slide from each GAC, and we're going to go through these in 2 minutes each. And I will just run the slides, and whoever is supposed to talk about them, please jump in, and then we'll have a panel discussion. We'll see what the common themes were. All right, so here we go. What worked, what didn't work? GAC 1, grid codes.
Yeah, so I think a lot of us had already touched on this exact point, which is clarifying the different understandings of the same terms and model. I think that point had already come up a lot. So for us, for example, even though at the beginning, we already thought we had 2 distinct types of generalization, one type was transferring the same structure across different environments, and the other one was inferring novel relationships. Turns out there's even more nuance than that than we had expected. So it's similar to what the generalization group was talking about. So we realized, there's so many different types of generalization, like the acquired equivalence one that was possible to accomplish via the eigenvectors of spectral regularization thing that I talked about, and other types such as novel inferences that would be only possible via the grid code, the inferred structure that Seongmin talked about. And then another point is it forced at least me to think hard about what was defensible in my viewpoint versus what isn't. So for example, when we had a long back and forth on what would be possible in terms of transferring structure across different environments, and it was through that we came to the realization that we really needed to factorize or abstract latent variables in order to transfer structure across environments that had different transition structure or different stimuli and therefore different transition matrices. And that actually brought us a lot closer to this same viewpoint because Seongmin's side was that you needed a factorized structure. The structure needs to be factorized from the stimuli, and then the conclusion that we came to, which is abstracting some sort of latent attribute or from the stimuli that would enable a successive representation to learn over, is actually really converging towards the same thing. And then the final thing that was interesting in the process is that we sort of had a similar set of studies that we were discussing in our review that we wrote, but we were coming at it in different viewpoints and interpreting them in different ways, whether they supported the successive representation or the factorized code representation. So that was also very illuminating to do. So yeah.
Great, thanks. I think we'll skim through all of these pretty quickly so that we can all have a discussion at the end. But yeah, thank you. And again, the putting these together, they all kind of had similar themes. So I think we will see that come out. So, all right, number 2, generalization of information. Go.
Yeah. So so like just to reiterate once more, I think there's a really it's really nice to see that this common theme kind of came across several of the groups, because it means that I think this GAC were meaningful in the sense that it might not have directly changed maybe the scientific idea or anything like in itself, but I think it changed the way that we approach the discussion. At least this is one of the ways that I saw and I felt it. So on one hand, it was really great to see and to actively seek these divergent views and ideas and opinions, because again, it's not something that we generally do, I think, and it was sort of great to be put into kind of the situation. I did, so myself and I think others as well in our group, we did learn and we got exposed to really new lines of work for which we were not necessarily interested initially, or not we were not aware of. We also learned that for any given sort of finding or result, there could be often multiple interpretation, especially when we look at this from a more I guess psychological, cognitive sort of science viewpoint. I see that often we can interpret things in multiple ways, unless we have a strong theory that makes prediction, and then things get easier. And yeah, as well, what we see as an opposite view, like across, let's say, 2 different or more people, maybe in fact we're not so distant in our opinion, in our sort of ideas, and discussing it in this kind of context was great to see. Now, there were actually a few challenges, I think, in this endeavor, and one was that, of course, we need to narrow down the scope of the debate without getting into sort of rabbit holes, because sometimes the discussion, it's easy to get caught about like some maybe like details, which might be important, but sometimes it might be better for the overall discussion to just supersede. It is not always easy for everyone to change our initial views. Sometimes it takes quite a few rounds. And one of the things, this was maybe for myself, but I thought that making progress only remotely through Zooms, especially our group, we had quite broad time zones, was something that really kind of hampered progress and discussion and so on. I always feel that in a way, sometimes multiple calls across maybe weeks or months, it's something that can be kind of a couple of days in person somewhere. It's something that you can get really much deeper, basically. And then finding common ground, compromises, different level of engagements. We had to deal with that. Some of the members were not that let's say present always, others were much more. So this is something that in our GAC we had to sort of adjust to. And then finally as well, the continuation of the GAC. I think this really laid the basis for really nice ideas for future work, for future experiments, and I think also for some nice collaborations as well that I hope and we hope would continue, perhaps through funding or other efforts.
Thanks, Aurelio. We will go through these quickly, but I'm sure that the same themes will come up over and over and over again. Okay, number 3.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So that's the probabilistic computations GAC. So our comments were basically, it was great to have systematic discussions. I think there was a lot of history to our particular controversy. The positions were pretty entrenched. The views had been passed on across generations of postdocs, and maybe at least one generation, maybe. And even though there were heated discussions like in person at conferences, they never, or I haven't witnessed them to go as deep as we were able to go over many weekly meetings, and it's hard to imagine how that would have happened otherwise. And I worry that even if it had been in person, like, I mean, sometimes I wish we could have just been in the same room for one day and we would have finished writing that paper. But I think having the break and having the engagement, having the break and having the engagement actually there was some value to it. So maybe a combination of both could be a even better model for the future. Discussing science was fun. Definitely one of my favorite things to look forward to during this Zoom age of COVID. As others, we had more agreements than expected, and there were surprisingly many misunderstandings. I mean, we all considered ourselves experts in this field to some degree, but it was surprising just how, like, yeah, exactly. I mean, I still learned a lot in that, and I think some others too. Maybe some less. Zach knew most of it already in advance, but no, I'm kidding. But there was a lot of learning. Now, advice for others. Oh yeah, the last one, carving out time on a document is hard. We also had, very uneven engagement. I think as long as you have a core group that kind of pushes forward, I think that can work. If then the less engaged members maybe represent opinions that are not necessarily representative positions, but can still regularly, I don't know, put comments on a joint document, or pipe up if something comes up that they feel strongly about. But it is a challenge. Our advice, I mean, finding a very specific goal. I think we bit off a bit too much in terms of just what we hope to accomplish. Being organized and having a specific goal for each meeting, so you feel a bit of accomplishment, is good. Being flexible is really good too, right? If you can't finish that discussion, then you just got to continue it, and then that's okay. I mean, having too much external stress isn't helpful, and I think that's what we, in the end, at least implicitly told ourselves. Okay, we're not gonna submit that paper next week, but we can plug along. Holding it accountable. I think, Zach, did you put that in? Do you want to elaborate?
No, it was there.
Okay, well, it was there.
I can't hold anyone accountable for that line.
and I won't. Okay, someone mentioned funding. I think it was Aurelio. We are definitely thinking, or a couple of us are thinking about applying to funding. There is a CRCNS mechanism where, that is explicitly for this, for, bringing people together. And yeah, I mean, we definitely won't be done, but even when our paper is submitted. So finding a way to continue this would be cool.
Great, thank you. I think that how to continue with funding and those types of mechanisms is something that would be productive to discuss as a group too, given that the structure, the content is very different across the GACs, but the structure is kind of the same. And so discovering mechanisms that are amenable to these types of collaborations, I think, would be of high value to everybody in this room. So we should talk about that. Okay, number 4.
All right, so I'll keep it short because it's a lot of overlap with everything else. So lessons: need to create a common vocabulary. Like we can't talk about the same things if we use the same words a different way. And I think this has come up with like almost every single one of the GACs. Need an abundance of goodwill in order to sustain the dialogue. I think that's a very critical one. We all really care about these things, and we are passionate about these things, and we disagree. And it's, it is not a pleasant experience. Oftentimes, we end meetings and it is just frustrating, right? Everybody's frustrated. We're all smart people, or at least we tell ourselves that. And we think we talk sense, and yet the other side doesn't get it. And it's like, it can be frustrating. And I think you need to do this with people that you respect already. And that you like. I think if you don't have that in advance, it's probably not going to work at all. So challenges, we don't use the same words the same way. Then we mentioned that many times. And this may be more specific to our case, but I don't even know that that's necessarily the case. If the issue under consideration has not been properly defined before then the definition becomes part of the argument, and that's a very much a circular way of doing things, which is terrible. So you want to discuss things that are well defined. The thing is, I think we all go into it thinking they're well defined, and then turns out that over the course of the discussion, we realize we have different definitions. So yeah, that's always going to be a challenge. That's it for me.
Thanks, Doby. What I like too is that I know that your controversy is a little bit younger than especially say the different methods of probabilistic representations in the brain controversy, which Ralf mentioned is generations old at this point. But it's interesting to see how many parallels there are, even though like the age of the controversy is so different, that some of these issues are maintained even through generations. So yeah. Okay, last two, number 5, recurrent neural networks.
Hiya. Yes, to very quickly go over this. So a lot of the time, I found, at least in our experience, mine and Franz's, we found panelists talking about things that were already agreed upon. But I think what everyone wants to see is, areas of contention. This is where it's usually the areas of contention where, science has the most ground to make up. And I think really focusing on hemming in the areas where people disagree is important. And maybe we agreed on a few too many things in the discussion. Another smaller point, which is very practical, is just that we decided to give, all these classes or lectures in the first half, and then a break, and then all of these debates about various subjects afterwards. I think it's important to really pinpoint which areas you're going to focus on, because with something like the brain, as soon as you have all these different areas of the brain, or metaphorical areas, it becomes a total mess trying to debate anything. So yeah, focus on specific questions.
Great, thanks. Okay, and then before we go into the, this one is animated. All right, I will click through.
Oops, sorry.
Tell me to.
You can just click it all on. Okay, so I think what we learned is that for me, the most important agreements that were unique to the GAC was one, the fact that we engaged with the community, especially early on, both through our proposal and the kickoff workshop. It's so rare when you work on a scientific project to get feedback at the very onset, but I think it was actually really crucial and something that would be something that I think I want to try and take with me even in future endeavors. We also, even though we engaged the larger community at several points, I think the most critical part was having pretty frequent meetings of our core team. And I think we were really lucky that I guess we had a relatively small core team in the GAC, and everyone I think was really engaged. I mean, not to say that people didn't get busy at various times, but they were always very fun and productive discussions. And then finally, the workshop itself was one of the most fun talks I've ever given. Even when I've been on panels or debates, I've never had, they've never really had that much of an adversarial nature to them. But in this case, they did. Someone spoke for 15 minutes after my 15-minute talk about what everything I said was wrong. And then we debated, and it was really fun. So I think it would be nice to bring things like that and to keep that in mind going forward. Some challenges, everyone's talked about the importance of finding common ground in your terminology. One thing that was challenging for us, I think, in writing the paper is when you're doing that, to not get so overgeneral that you're then watering things down and not really saying anything. And your solutions are not really addressing anything substantive. Another challenge was having ongoing community engagement. So we had a lot of great feedback on our proposal and a lot of participation at our GAC. But when it came time to writing the actual opinion piece, it's just like the longer things go on, it's harder to keep soliciting community engagement. So I think thinking about ways to keep the community engaged going forward would be really useful. And then, like other people have talked about, the feasibility of continued work is hard. So we also have goals for continuing. We're looking into funding mechanisms, but I think even a relatively modest amount of funding for each GAC could go a long way, just in keeping everyone accountable and keeping you all having a common goal to be working towards.
Awesome.
Can I ask a question? Just interject.
Yeah, so now we're done. Yeah.
Okay. It seems like different GACs had pretty different processes for what they were doing. Like, I think ours was very non-imaginative. We had our workshop, and then it was, you know, the organizers that met more or less, you know, starting at some point weekly when the paper deadline came closer. But it seems like there was more like there was, you know, lectures like Joe talked about, like tutorials, and Leila, what do you mean by community engagement?
I just meant mostly, I mean, we all put up when you put up the opinion pieces on open review, just trying to get reviews in response to that. That was actually something that I think we could have done better.
You mean at the very beginning, the proposals, or you're talking at the end?
No, the paper at the end. In the revision portion of the paper, right? We got the reviewer comments that were really useful, but I think it might be good to have another mechanism to get more thoughts on that final paper.
We also invited external speakers for the workshop, which I think was also helpful because they identified some issues and takes on the subject that we didn't really account for in the proposal. We also made a Slack that people could join after the proposal, and we have like 70 people on it, and it's great. We did not do a good job of keeping people engaged. I think this is something we really could have done. And maybe like I'll post something now, you know, saying the paper's out, you know, we have this like progress meeting, but it's definitely something we could have done even more, but didn't quite.
So do you think that having maybe something like a quarterly kind of like, or encouraging all of the current GACs, but also the new GACs to have like a quarterly update kind of thing might be beneficial, or would that just be annoying to, depending on which group you're part of? Like, I think, yeah. Do you think that would have helped, like the folks in your Slack, for example, like if there was even just like a webinar that you guys held? No?
I think the paper so far has done a really good job of like having intermittent deadlines for us. I'm worried once the paper's done that's when we're going to need extra driving motivation.
So what would that be? No, like I think I want to continue this because this is kind of important. Like keeping momentum over the years. This is supposed to be like a longer term project, hopefully, for the benefit of the GAC groups, but also hopefully for the benefit of the whole community. And so I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about how to keep the momentum, how to keep community engagement, potentially have other people get engaged that might read your opinion paper or anything.
I have a suggestion. I mean, something that I thought was really fantastic was Alex Boucher, you know, I don't know how many years ago, so I can probably say, you know, started having an online journal club long before the, you know, COVID Zoom time, with some of his former postdocs and then other people too, like myself. Every 2 weeks, could be original research, could be paper discussions, and I think that was a great way to create a community and to keep, you know, arguments, you know, alive on a topic that we all cared about. And so I think, you know, maybe that could be an outgrow of a GAC, where maybe even on the GAC website, right, there is a schedule then for, I don't know, once a month follow-up of like online, again, could be original research, could be journal clubs that kind of keep the topic alive and create a community.
Maybe I will do a little counterpoint. So I think that it is also enormous amount of work, and, you know, realistically, maybe we got like a paper out of it, but it was, you know, especially because of the uneven engagements, it always lies on somebody's shoulders, and that person had to carry, you know, kind of the whole thing together. So like putting something yet else again, there will be no thank yous for running a journal club, yet it is, you know, like I'm running even in my department things, and it's a lot of work finding the speakers, choosing the papers. It takes a lot of time, but there is nothing kind of, you know, in the academic currency. So I'm just worried that, again, like somebody who will end up having this on their shoulders will do a lot of service and they'll suck a lot of time in the event. So my view is that I feel like it was really useful, even like with modest goals. So I feel like we kind of had the range of like people really engaged. We, like Aurelio and I and Jesse, we hope to maybe collaborate in the future and maybe do something together. But again, like, because we are empiricists, funding is crucial. I cannot just run a study that is interest of all of us with, you know, having to pay $500 an hour for fMRI time. So that's just not realistic without funding. We can't even run a single study, even though we came up with 3, right? Unless we get funding. But we each have our own line of program. And even those who are like, you know, I would say just a teeny bit engaged, still the discussion kind of brushed off of them. And for, as Aurelio was saying, for example, Pan and Masamichi are now running, and they are going to look at the hippocampus that they've never cared about. But now it seems like, oh, but you are finding it in humans, and other people found it in similar tasks. So I feel like even with modest goals, this is still really helpful. I'm just worried that the more kind of obligation there would be on the GAC to do things, essentially more unpaid labor, if I'm going to be brutal about it, the harder it is going to be to either find people, or to harder it will be on those who end up carrying it on their shoulders.
Yeah, so I totally understand that argument, and I think maybe a part of this might be a little bit of a misconception of what the suggestions might have been. So I think what we're asking from the program committee side or from the CCN side is more about how can we further support the GACs if you want to. Is there anything we can do structurally? Like, I can imagine, hey, look, you're at a stage where you think you want to run a workshop, right? Because, I don't know, now you want fresh input, or you want to make sure that there's more community engagement, or maybe you want to run like a competition on some analysis or whatever it is. And in that case, I think CCN can absolutely be very helpful in, you know, just leveraging the mailing list, for example, and say, hey, look, there's an online workshop being organized. Everyone is invited to that. It's free and you can get engaged. Just a random example, right? So I don't think it's what the goal here is not to add to the plate. The goal is to find ways we can help you achieve your goals. And like the implicit understanding, to me at least, is that you all motivated to actually achieve those goals, because these are all questions that are, you know, at the heart of what you care about scientifically.
Yeah.
I might be wrong. Please correct me and express other opinions. Sorry, Doby.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think one specific suggestion would be, so there's a lot of people who attend the workshops, but then they sort of get lost, right? I think one option would be to just create a mailing list, like for each GAC, where, you know, do you want to sign up for very occasional updates from this GAC? And then that gives us an opportunity to engage with the community. So maybe, you know, every 2-3 months, when there's something to say or to ask from these people, we can be like, hey, we put up a preprint. Hey, you know, we want commentaries or something like that. Because I feel like right now it's hard to get commentaries, mostly because it's hard to reach that target group of people again.
Well, maybe what we can do after this too is just poke the whole CCN mailing list and say like, and add and create like, sign me up for not just the general like CCN list buttons, but also, would you like to be part of this GAC mailing list? Would you like to sign up? And then give the organizers of each GAC direct access to those mailing lists so that you can send stuff out. I think that's probably something that we can do. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's how I see it too. I mean, try to use the GAC as the seed for a community. And whether it's a mailing list or whether it's a Slack channel, or, I mean, I can't, or maybe even if the information is just on the CCN GAC website, I mean, I think that could be productive and sustainable.
Yeah, the way I'm thinking about this, you know, there's several GACs that I am interested in, but I'm not gonna like put up with daily Slack messages from like another GAC, or I would not, you know, I'm not going to be checking the CCN website on updates from them because I have other things. But if I get an email in my mailbox, I'll read it, as long as it's not every week, right? And I think probably other people are on this, you know, sort of in the same boat.
I actually prefer the other way. Email just clutters up my inbox. I like to have things organized by topic. And I think that the Slack channel is something that's been really good. If there's some stuff I can, you know, skim through it. But I think that ultimately the work is going to be done by, as we've seen many times, a small core group of people. And so if you find the core group of people, I think you can run with it and you can open it up to more people if others want to get involved at a high level. And people who don't want to be involved, they can sort of watch things go by and chime in when they like. So I think that there's a nice aspect of being flexible about how much engagement you want, which is depending on how much you care about that topic and how much you really want to have a generative adversarial collaboration. I think that, you know, in ours, it was a small group that really enjoyed having those discussions. And if other people wanted to join, we would welcome it. I think then the question becomes communication. How do you tell people that these conversations are happening and say, you're welcome to join if you want? And I think that that's one, you know, but they tend to be like, if you open it up to everybody, then all of a sudden some of the core aspects start to dissolve, like some of the things that you find valuable. So it's a very delicate balance, I think, to find community engagement, but remain like focused in a way that makes progress.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I totally appreciate that for different people, different aspects or different ways of working, communicating, etc., works better than for others. But so I guess what we can encourage everyone from the current, but also the future GACs to do is to let us know what their needs are. If you want to send a message out from time to time to the whole CCN mailing list, I don't think that would be a problem as long as it's not like super frequent. If you want to have a sub web page somehow, or you create a web page and you want us to link to that to provide regular updates to the community, perfect, that'd be great. If you want to advertise a Slack channel or whatever it is, so like feel free to reach out. I mean, part of what we want to do is support the CCN community in those endeavors, and whatever you think would be helpful, we're happy to try.
Yeah, I think the you know, like, you know, those emails or Slack or so, you know, some people, you know, it might work for some and so on, not for others, but at least it would expand the pool of people who can interact with the GAC and make the GAC itself maybe more flexible. So I think, yeah, this was one common thing that almost every group has a core team and then other members around. For some teams, I guess, for some GACs, it worked really well. For others, those who were less engaged, maybe in our case, we have to struggle a bit more. But I think if we have this kind of mechanism that allows other people to, you know, to have a bit more interaction, those who initially are not part of it, makes, I think, the GAC maybe a little bit more, I don't know, goes more alive and, you know, more flexible in the sense that it doesn't have to be really the, I don't know, the 5, 6, 10 people who are there at the beginning that have to be there at the, you know, like at the end. Because in a way, otherwise, I feel like, you know, there's this kind of sort of tacit or implicit understanding that those are starting and they have to be there. If it's more open, maybe things can be a bit more organic.
I think this is a really good point. This is something that we had originally envisioned, but I think did not do a super great job at this first time around, which is to say that the people who propose the GAC to begin with, and who even come to the workshop to begin with, don't necessarily need to be the only people who are doing it the whole time. And that we want to have this community engagement, which without it being unpaid service and labor and work, which I totally recognize, like we're all being pulled in 1,000 different directions. And the last thing we want to do is create more responsibility without any benefit to the people who are actually doing that labor. But I think, Aurelio, your point is really well taken, that finding ways to encourage the community to get involved if they want to, if they're interested, after the end of the workshop, as the progress continues to be made and the discussions continue to happen and new experiments come up, and maybe there is someone who says, oh, I've actually got a little pilot funding to be able to work on that. Can I come and join? Or, oh, I have like a local mechanism where we could, put in an intramural grant for $10,000 and we could like see if we could get a little data on that. Those mechanisms do exist. And if we can get people engaged who they see an idea and they just leap at it, then that could actually propel these projects forward in a very concrete way. And I think we did not a super great job of continuously and vocally encouraging members of the community to actually get involved with the GACs after their initial formation, their initial workshops. And I think that maybe we can do a better job this coming round. And this doesn't have to exclude all of the current GACs either, but for especially the new ones, we can be very loud and vocal about saying that this isn't just a passive watch them debate exercise. This is, if you want to chime in, raise your hand, take the mic, be involved. Yeah,
I think that you're absolutely right. We did not do a good enough job to sort of advertise the fact that this is supposed to be a community effort that is led by you GAC leaders, but it's open to everyone to join who's interested in the topic. And typically you would imagine the people that join would be the ones that are actively working on these exact kind of questions, right? Sorry, Doby.
I was going to say, I think you guys did a very good job at advertising that. I think just in practice, it didn't happen very much because it just didn't happen very much. I think the organizers were not the issue.
Well, it might be just a question of sort of like, putting it front and center on the GAC website. After CCN sending like a follow-up email saying like, thank you for all the attendees and for all the participation. FYI, if you haven't been able to make it, here are the recordings, and you are invited explicitly, if you're interested, to join all of these different endeavors. And that's something we did not do last year, and I think that's something we could have. I always see us as being, we can always improve on things. So, and if it's easy things like that, then we should definitely do it.
I mean, we did talk about this, and I think we actually in the end left it up to the GACs to some degree how willing they would be. And there is a cost, right? As Zach pointed out, there's a community can have different layers of how properly you want to be involved, and sometimes, for instance, for the discussions that we have had, I think if the group had been much bigger, I think there's a very good chance we wouldn't have made the progress. And so, but at the same time, I think I'd be very happy, and I would love for this GAC to continue. Whether it's even if it's for instance, in the context of an online journal club or talk series. So anyway, so I think having multiple tiers, and then for those they don't want to be on Slack, but then over time I'm sure I'm going to move on with my life, but hopefully someone else who has been going to this or being a regular can move in and move out. But I think we can't do all at once, I think. So I think it makes sense to have different solutions for different parts, like Slack for some, and a quarterly email for others.
Yeah, I mean, our plan is to sort of bug you or bug all the GACs yearly about whether you want to give an update, progress, or whatever it is. And I can imagine that at some point, some of you might think, okay, we've sort of made enough progress here and identified a more specific question. It's time for a new GAC tackling that more specific question and things like that. And then you carry on. Maybe you want to abandon and maybe someone else will pick up the slack. I don't know. But there's all kinds of different mechanisms, I guess. But for me, from my point of view, it's always about what can we do better in terms of supporting you. And Leila mentioned earlier that the deadlines were really useful. And so I want to have a brief discussion about that, because we gave you a pretty tight deadline initially about the opinion paper. And then obviously we expected things to be pushed out, and they have been. But like almost everyone sort of like followed through in well, I'm hoping that everyone will follow through in the end. But we have one actually published now, and we have 4 more in revision, and so we have one commentary actually submitted now as well. And again, I would encourage everyone to encourage your field to submit commentaries. But is there anything? So how does that work with the deadline? Should we keep those tight deadlines to make sure that there's sort of like a continuous reminder that, hey, you're supposed to be working on this? Or was that inappropriate from our end? Would you have liked it to be more open-ended? I would like to get some feedback here in terms of whether we should adjust this or not.
I think one issue is, to what degree is it actually a deadline, right? Like a deadline is only meaningful if there's a dead in it.
Yeah, so sorry, it was more like a suggested timeline.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fine. And if it were a deadline, that's also totally fine. It concentrates the mind. There were just times that we thought that we'd be able to hit the deadline, and we didn't. But I didn't mind the periodic encouragement and momentary panic. It has limited utility, but it's not zero.
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial deadline was really useful. I think that's what restarted the discussions in our GAC, right? We get together, we have the workshop, and then there's a bit of a lull afterwards, and then the rest of the fall semester hits. And so having then that deadline early the coming year kind of, focuses the mind, as puts it, and gets people on a weekly schedule, and let's get this done. Actually, I think it's also good that it was sliding. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted one more source of real stress in my life.
I would also talk about the position paper actually, but actually it's a good time that you're talking about this deadline. So I think deadline is fine, but I think I want to ask a little bit more detail than deadline. So one of the things is actually that we didn't know that what this the position paper is supposed to be, because we might be the first one. And also it's a kind of the time, it's one of the big milestones, but actually it's one of the time that you realize that actually there's more discrepancy too, actually. So you realize it just before the deadline that now you realize that we have a big disagreement. In that case, you need a more time kind of thing. But this open position paper, I feel like it, the only thing is there's no big guideline about what this position paper is supposed to be, but plus there is no flexibility about that how this position paper can be. For example, that one of the issues that I feel a little hard to dealing with is that in the paper, you are in the author, but you are saying the different things in the paper. So people don't know that. So if you follow from the beginning, maybe they can know, but if it's not in the case, they might think that everybody agree about this opinion in every sentence, which is can be true in the general scientific paper, but it's not the case in this kind of paper series, right? So I just feel like it find a way, so kind of find a tone actually to make it calm down, and we kind of look like an agreement or more like an open question direction kind of thing. I don't know, it was actually necessary or just to leave it the dynamics of the controversy as it is in the record. So I think there is not answer, but I would like to have a more flexibility for this kind of the open paper for the next GAC actually.
That's a great, sorry.
I meant more flexibility in the structure of that paper, or in how many there are. I'm kind of envisioning.
Yeah, so I'm not, again, it's not my answer, but I thought about it in our case. For example, one case can be each of one of us can have a more short version of the position paper, for example. So it means that you can just make sure that what is my position, and you can just see the other people's position as a position paper. In the case, you can have a two paper. Sorry, there is some silence outside. But okay, and after that, as an example, if we happen to have some good community member, for example, one of the surprising good, but also kind of very surprising is that we have actually 6 reviewer or something like that, 7 reviewer. There's so many reviewers actually allow. I mean, we are happy that because everybody want to give some comments, but it means that we might feel like that if we can have this kind of community before, maybe we can be like editor of some small journal. In the case, we can just focus on about, okay, can you just to make some paper about this? It doesn't need to be because, but as the Arsa say, actually being editor and small journal can be also one of the currency of the academia kind of thing. It doesn't need, but if you happen to have a community, why we need to put everything into one bowl? Maybe you can just creating a bigger bowl like a journal, one issue, special issue, and we can be like a co-editor or something. Then you can just invite the people and making another paper series kind of thing. Just a suggestion, yeah.
Yeah, so sort of like a collection of individual commentaries or papers rather than sort of a joint paper, which as Seongmin pointed out, it was hard to attribute opinions to like all of the authors, especially if there's a disagreement. But if everybody, like each group wrote a smaller paper in addition with community members, I think that would be really good. And yeah, again, going back to the whole like rewards thing, one thing was that like, even though there were deadlines, if the rewards aren't such, especially for like younger scientists or emerging scientists like us, having rewards like funding, like even some sort of pilot funding or yes, like maybe editor credit or something, that would be more motivating to do all the work and was also, yeah, make it worthwhile.
I mean, to us, sorry, I'm just going to chime in here before Das, I see your hand. For us, the credit was guaranteed publication, pretty much, right? I mean, we will not reject any of the papers. We wanted this to be a useful piece for the community. So the other aspect I want to briefly like reply to Seongmin. So you mentioned 2 things. One is that the instructions were kind of vague, and at the other time you wanted to have more flexibility, which sort of to me sounded like you wanted better instructions, which would be more constrained, but then more flexibility at the same time. So okay, let me just tell you what we envisioned. So we wanted to keep this as open as possible on purpose, so that everyone can provide a meaningful contribution to the field. The original idea was, of course, to outline the controversy and then essentially to say, here's what we agreed on would provide, like as a group, including both sides, would provide a good way forward to resolve some of our differences. But you bring up a good point that like one of the things that the traditional way of writing a paper does not allow you to do in that case is to say, well, whose opinion is which? And I would say, well, you can be totally creative here, and your paper is still in revision, right? So feel free to write in for each paragraph or each section that outlines different hypotheses, just in brackets, the authors. Here are the different people that subscribe to this, and here are the different people that subscribe to that. And here are the people maybe that don't have an opinion or that subscribe to a little bit to this. So you can be arbitrarily creative, I would say. So this is what was sort of like our original idea overall, but definitely we'd be open to other formats. And then of course you can in a way you can write an opinion paper to your own paper if you want, to your own position paper, right? If you want to say something that has not made it, for example, into the whatever the consensus position paper,
like a concurring opinion in the Supreme Court. There's the Supreme Court's decision, and then there's concurrences.
Yeah, we did that a couple of years ago. Not to toot my own horn, but I just put the link in the chat. It was a debate, a 4-way debate, followed by an opinion piece where we actually signed the different opinions that were following up from that. And there was an intro that was signed by 2 people, and then we each had like these kind of different pieces. And we don't necessarily, it doesn't need to be exactly this way, but it was, we could use this kind of format, absolutely, and say this is the part that was authored by everybody, where we kind of clarify the terminology, and then here are the parts that clarify what the exact positions are, and they're signed by different people. We could also have a section at the beginning that says, here are the people who kind of sit on which sides of which debate, and have that be a codified mechanism. So sorry to jump in. I know Dasa and Anna, you've had your hands up for a bit, but I just want to say that we can absolutely do this. I like this idea a lot.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that, it's happy to hear that what you just say there, but also that in the beginning it was very not, as you say, it was not that given, but also a lot of parties, we also discover why we're making that actually. So I think it might be better to give more options. It can be like a multiple position paper, or it can be like you can have a own authorship in each section even. So maybe you can just suggest this kind of a next one. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Dasa.
So yeah, I think that I would just echo that, like it would be, I thought that the January deadline after like October workshop was insane. Right, because you often have 3 months to revise a paper that you already wrote, of a study you've already run. And part of it was like, part of the instructions was write about your progress, right? So it's kind of like the instructions just weren't really kind of compatible with the deadline. So I would think that the January, like, I think you can still write the reminder emails, but not kind of do that sort of ridiculous first deadline that of course needed to be pushed. Because that's just not even, right, in academic life, that's just not on anybody's plate to be able to do that. Or do it differently, right? Like at the beginning, we just kind of, essentially, it's just another kind of like continuation of that first proposal, like an update of the first proposal. And we are not resolving anything, we are just kind of little bit revising of how do we see the problem, perhaps. So maybe like those can be both accommodated, or there can be like explicitly listed multiple options.
Yeah, so in terms of update, I mean, yeah, so we might need to specify this a little bit more. What we really meant is from the point where you submitted, and that was like, I forget what the deadline was last year, but somewhere in the summer, right? Submitted the initial proposal, you got like the feedback on the open review, you got the kickoff workshop with lots of feedback. So through those and through then your own, I would suppose, follow up after those events, we had imagined that you would have made some progress in thinking through that, and that's what we meant by what progress had been made. Obviously, not in terms of, okay, how many experiments did you do? How many papers? No, I mean that would be totally unrealistic.
Yeah, I think that maybe the wording can just be a little bit more gentle or more specified. And also, I think that Jesse, who took on kind of the first draft duties in our group, sort of went a little bit into like understood it more as a review paper, in which case it's again was difficult to find. But when we, kind of reread the instructions and said, okay, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to agree on it. So, I mean, we just, mostly we wrote the kind of as a group, but we had sections where we said, some of us consider this to be generalizations, while other would never use this term. for this and would instead use transfer. So we didn't necessarily have the names who is in this camp and that camp, because kind of the controversy wasn't initially about the terminology, but about it was more mechanistic. Yeah. So we ended up putting it in, or we were discussing kind of like what turned out not to be really two camps, that we turn out not to be really two camps, so we can't quite like write it against each other anymore, because we realized we actually agree way more than we thought. There were some challenges when individual members wanted certain things in a paper, and then how to reorganize the paper to fit that in, things like that. So yeah, we agree that it's challenging for 6 people to write together one paper, but it sort of can be done because this particular format allows you to put the signpost telling, well, we actually didn't agree on this thing, and like make it explicit, because it's an opinion paper. So it's not like what opinion you have as a group, but what opinions are there.
Great. Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you so much. Anna.
Yeah, so I think for our group, the format we've had overall roughly worked pretty well for doing what we wanted to do, which was to write an opinion piece, right? For like getting the ideas out there, talking about the definitions, all the things we've already discussed. Now that we want to continue working on this GAC, right? Like the goals now in year 2 are different from what they were in year 1. And specifically, right, like if we want these ideas to be accepted in the community, to have some weight, to be discussed, we want them to be backed by something, right? By data analysis, by computational modeling, by new experiments, something. And so there we think, the current format will need to be augmented by something. And that's why Leila, right, and some others from other groups brought up the idea of funding, right? Like, I don't think it's feasible to ask for like money for a full fMRI study, but just saying like, look, we give you $1,000. And so now some of the labs on the GAC will know, okay, like now we need to assign a person to do some work to account for those $1,000, right? Which is not like a huge amount, but it's enough to justify, right? I'm not a PI, I have PIs on my team. And so I'm asking them, guys, like, I need the grad student or a postdoc to help me do this work, to like actually do this hands-on work rather than just talking about ideas. And asking them to do it without having a support mechanism is pretty.
So I don't know, Megan, do you want to comment on what we did this year briefly?
For
like inviting funders?
Yeah, I think we can do that. So this year we did actually, without asking directly for money, and maybe a few of them actually might still be with us, I'm not sure, but we did actually send emails to a bunch of contacts at funding agencies, just inviting them to this workshop to say, like, kind of to advertise, this is the mechanism that we're working on, this is the project that we're collectively working on, in the hopes that some of them might see, oh, this project sounds really cool, and it sounds like something that we might want to support scientifically, or this process sounds really cool, and it sounds like something that we might want to support scientifically. And I did see funders from, at the very least, 1 or 2 of those funding agencies here in terms of just recognizing names. And so our hope is that little seed funds, not like huge, massive grants, of course, but that little seed funds might come out of this, and that this is a way of us advertising your project to these funding agencies, so that you could then either independently submit a proposal, or that maybe CCN could, after this workshop, and after, now we'll have a few more GACs under our belt this year and a few more workshops, to say, look, here is this portfolio. Would you like to nurture this, please? And hopefully little pots of money like you're suggesting would become available. That's our goal. And so at least a few of them showed up today, and hopefully we'll also be watching at least the recording of the first part to see what you guys are doing, which is really exciting.
And yeah, so that's really cool to hear.
sorry, one thing I
Yeah.
mentioned in the chat is that so we invited a few of those funders that are generally in the right, right hemisphere kind of thing. But obviously, like every single funding mechanism has like their specifics in terms of interest. And so it's very hard for us, especially when we're not in your field, to figure out for you in a certain way who might provide funding. And definitely, I don't think we have the person power to actually like go through applying for individual support or anything like that. So that was sort of like our way to try to help in a certain way a little bit. Our hope was from the beginning, I think, that the GACs would fit pretty straight into your current funding scheme. So because they're part of, well, hopefully you'll be working on something that is funded and that is part of your research portfolio general interest, and therefore funding would be less of an issue. And the hope was, at least to get started, and the hope was then that through the GACs, you might build a team that would allow you to apply in a very competitive way for new funds and carry on sort of like the work. If this is all supposing that if you submitted a GAC in the first place, this is a topic that's close to your heart. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gone through all the trouble of doing this.
Yeah, and a little bit more broadly, I guess, like even like beyond money, the high level point is that the incentives during year 2 will be different than the incentives for year 1. And right now we're not like 100% sure what they would be or should be. And I think that's something to think about. Yeah,
that is a good point. And if you have any ideas or things you would like to see, please send them our way. We're like we're new to this too, so we're learning with you and through you.
We're totally making this up as we go as well.
Ralf.
Speaking of which, I mean, when I remember our original discussions about this, I mean, in the end, the goal really was to get people from different sides together so they could agree on kind of a research proposal that would then be fundable. And by bringing people from different sides together, we'd have a higher chance for coming up with a proposal, or they would have a higher chance, not just that gets funded or that supports their favorite idea, but that actually moves the field forward by distinguishing between different hypotheses. So I think, and it leads to the point I actually wanted to make is, I think even already for that first product after the workshop, I think the workshop itself is already is a contribution to the field, right? If a couple of people get together with different opinions and they have a lively discussion in public, I think that's good. But then the first product afterwards, which is right now the paper that we were talking about for quite some time, what should be the ideal format? Should it be, a set of papers in a special issue? Should it be one paper? What credit? But I don't think there needs to be one right solution for every GAC, right? For some GACs, the right solution might be a paper in the current format. For others, it might be maybe, partly tutorial, something maybe what we're doing in defining all the terms, creating the same common language, et cetera, without even touching the actual controversy yet. And for yet others, they might be ready to write up a short grant proposal, right? And then maybe if you have that workshop, then 2-3 months later is not a crazy time frame for coming up with a some kind of proposal. At least for those who partially partake in the CS computer science conference after conference, deadline after deadline circuit. So anyway, so all I'm trying to say is that I don't think CCN is particularly set on one particular format, and we can entertain different ones. And once we have a few of these out there, I think it'll also be easier to answer the question. Well, we can't define what the specifics of that paper will be, but here are 5 from last year. Check them out and see where you want to fit in.
Yeah, totally. And by the way, like open invitation to everyone. If you want to write follow-up papers, complementary things, opinions on your own paper where you can criticize all your co-authors or whatever you want to do, like feel free to send them our way. We'd be happy to make them part of the NBDT GAC collection.
Yeah, we've got this collection that we can kind of do whatever we want with.
Yep.
In terms of the structure of it, and we'll be working to put it up in a beautiful, like easily navigable format as well, so that you can see which opinion pieces go with which papers very easily, and maybe ties between them. And so, yeah, like let's flexibly adapt whatever this format needs to be. And if it's one of these position pieces is a dictionary, as Ralf said, almost, you know, it's an encyclopedia that's like, here's the language we're going to use before we even get to the controversy, then that's beautiful. And that's a fantastic contribution. And then, you know, further opinion pieces can be attached to that and say, okay, now that we've defined the dictionary, now here's the next update, you know, almost like a blog post kind of thing.
Yeah, and really the part of the goal here, and I mentioned this earlier in the introduction, is to sort of keep the history of the argument and the development of sort of like thoughts together somehow. And this is what we would like to do through the GAC website, is essentially not just linked to the individual papers, but also you can see your initial proposal there on open review. You can see get the recordings from your kickoff workshop. And if you're really interested in a topic, you can sort of like go through all of them and see how ideas and thoughts and opinions have evolved. Doby.
2 more hands, and then we should probably close up for the day.
Yep.
Just a super fast practical suggestion. I find the communication with authors exclusively via Slack a little tough for those of us who don't use Slack as like the primary thing, and also makes it harder to communicate to everybody else in the group. So I have sent so many emails at this point, like, hey, this is what I wrote on Slack, and like it is just, and you know, over email, it just felt like a lot. So I don't know. I think there's probably going to be different opinions on this, but at least for like big announcements, if you can have a mailing list with all of the authors and of all of the GACs, so that everybody gets the big announcements, rather than, you know, each of us needs to like forward to everybody. I think that'll help me. But
yeah. I mean, part of the reason to use Slack is to actually get rid of the burden to have to write emails, and then they get lost in your stack of emails. And like Zach says, he doesn't ever read them and things like that. Slack is nicely organized. Everything is there, and and if you need it again, you can find it very easily again. It's still right there. You can scroll up, and you know, you never lose anything, kind of thing. Unless you write like more than 10,000 messages.
Don't disappear.
The free account disappears after 10,000 messages.
No, emails don't get lost as long as you don't delete them. Anyway.
Well, they land in spam, and then you know, they get deleted, and who else, whatever else. So, but the other thing is that for us in terms of organizers, it's harder too, right? Because it's much easier to quickly write like a Slack message, send that out, than to send like emails to mailing lists, and then having to deal with replies potentially and all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So I don't know. And the other aspect that we thought would be useful on Slack, although it hasn't been used that much, unfortunately, although I don't know what kind of private messaging has been going on in the background, because we don't see that, obviously. But we were hoping that the different GACs would talk to each other through the Slack group and exchange sort of like ideas and, hey, how are you dealing with this? Or you know, what kind of sections are you planning to have in your paper because we kind of lost, or whatever it is. So that was our hope. It didn't quite happen, and maybe again this is our fault because we didn't specify these things up front enough. Maybe we should for the next round. But I of course understand that, you know, there's different affinities in terms of which piece of technology to use for communication, and yeah, we're probably somewhat biased here. Megan and I, for sure.
I think that everybody will really appreciate you guys to organize everything for us and everything. I believe it's going to be better every year. Thanks for that. Just one thing I want to think about it is actually that about the funding agency thing, actually. So one of the things I saw in the other conferences is really helpful is actually that they invited the PO and actually kind of have a Q&A session or kind of interview session kind of thing, and also including like the journal editors too. I think we are in the kind of special position, like in the machine learning plus the some the experimental or theoretical neuroscientists. So there are some specific journals that we are actually interested in. And also there's some the collaborative funding. Actually, the DASA mentioned in the chat, I think it's a good idea. There's some specific funding only allow us for kind of international the collaborative funding. But we want to know that what kind of research they're looking for, and what the thing that we might don't know yet, but good to think about it. So if you can inviting this kind of people actually as a session while we are organizing the workshop, actually it will help a lot, I think.
I think that's a great idea.
I think
so coming from both sides, right? So
exactly,
having the funders see what the GAC teams are doing, and then also the funders present to the teams, essentially, this is what we're looking for.
Yes.
Yeah. We did, yeah, I think that what we did this year was the first step in the right direction there, and what we should do maybe for the remaining workshops if we can this year, but certainly for next year when we're back in person, hopefully, wouldn't that be wonderful? To actually invite POs and editors, as you said. And I think that if we can take some time before that meeting happens to solicit suggestions from all of the GACs, because as Gunnar said, like this is a very wide group in terms of expertise and area of research and so on, but we all know who is in our niche. And so if we can get a collection ahead of time of specific people to invite to that workshop, and to that, like the version of this workshop next year that will be in person can include that aspect, which I think would be really beneficial. You're totally right. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, and we should totally do it. And I took lots of notes, you guys. So
it's also all recorded.
It is, yeah, it is.
Okay, any last suggestions that you really want to give us? If you know, something else comes up later on, please feel free to drop us a line. We're more than happy to do whatever we can to further support your amazing initiatives.
Yeah, you know how to find us. Send us a message on Slack, maybe not email. But you can also email, but seriously, like if there's other stuff that we can do. I think we'll beef up a lot of our documentation for kind of guidance of the new GACs and the position pieces, and the goals, and how the goal isn't to resolve the controversy by January and so on. I think that a lot of this has been really helpful. So I want to thank you all for your feedback and your honesty and your participation in this process and your patience with us as we kind of figured out what this is supposed to look like. Yeah, this is really helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a totally new format, so we're learning at the same time as you're doing, and we're totally relying on your feedback to, you know, optimize the process so that the outcome is as, you know, beneficial for you and for the community as possible. So thank you so much for all the feedback, and I think that was a great session. I greatly enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for organizing.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, all right. Well, we'll close up. See you all on Slack, I guess. Bye.